The Merovingian Dynasty stands as one of the earliest and most enigmatic ruling families of medieval Europe, remembered not only for its political influence, but for the aura of myth that surrounded its origins and its decline. Emerging in the 5th century from the shifting world of late Roman Gaul and the migrating Germanic tribes, the Merovingians created a dynasty that would shape the foundations of the Frankish kingdoms, and, through them, the entire course of European history. To understand their story is to step into a time when the old Roman order was collapsing, when Christianity was still establishing its place in society, and when kingship itself was evolving into new forms of authority. The Merovingians were not remembered simply as rulers of men, but as figures woven into legend, their long hair carrying symbolic meaning, their bloodline rumoured to have carried traces of something more than human. The earliest accounts of their origins tell of a semi-mythical figure named Merovech, from whom the dynasty takes its name. His story lies partly in the realm of history and partly in folklore, with tales suggesting a supernatural conception that bound the family to forces beyond the ordinary. Whether believed or dismissed, these stories played a crucial role in shaping the aura of sacred kingship that the dynasty carried for generations. From Merovech's supposed lineage would come Clovis, the first great unifier of the Franks, whose reign transformed the scattered tribes into a single kingdom, and whose conversion to Christianity linked the dynasty forever with the Roman Church. What follows is a journey through centuries of shifting power, rival heirs, and sacred ritual, where the Merovingian kings stood both as real political actors and as symbols of legitimacy. Their authority rested not only on their armies and alliances, but on the belief that their blood carried an ancient mandate, a connection between the earthly realm and the divine. From the rise of Clovis to the reign of Dagobert, from the power struggles of his sons to the decline into shadow kingship and the rise of the mayors of the palace, the dynasty's story is one of both grandeur and slow erosion. It was a history that ended with their displacement by the Carolingians, yet their memory lingered, resurfacing in medieval chronicles and even in modern legends that sought to trace hidden bloodlines across centuries. To follow the Merovingians is to trace the transformation of Europe itself, as Roman Gaul became Francia, as pagan ritual gave way to Christian order, and as kingship passed from myth to administration, then back into myth again. It is a story told not in sudden breaks, but in a long continuity, one that still carries echoes of ancient power and medieval imagination. The origins of the Merovingian dynasty are wrapped in a veil of legend and memory, where the border between history and myth blurs so completely that one cannot always tell where fact ends and sacred story begins. In the early medieval imagination, genealogy and kingship were not simply biological inheritances. They were lineages imbued with meaning, where a family's claim to rule depended as much on the power of story as on the strength of armies. The Merovingians, like many ruling houses of the ancient and medieval world, cultivated traditions that rooted them in something older than themselves, something that reached back to times of gods, monsters, and mysterious forces tied to the sea and to the earth. The Frankish peoples among whom the Merovingians rose were not a single nation at first, but a confederation of tribes whose presence along the Rhine and in the northern reaches of Roman Gaul had grown in the later centuries of the Roman Empire. They were known to the Romans as federati, allied peoples who provided soldiers for imperial armies while settling within Roman territory. These Franks were diverse, divided into different groupings such as the Salian Franks and the Ripuarian Franks, with shifting alliances and leaders who often balanced loyalty to Rome with their own ambitions for independence. By the 5th century, as Roman authority in the West faltered and finally collapsed, the Franks emerged as one of the most powerful groups in the former imperial lands. It was within this setting that the Merovingians appeared, their ancestry traced back to a mysterious figure named Merovech. The story of Merovech's conception was already unusual in the chronicles that survive from later centuries. One version, recorded in the history of the Bishop Gregory of Tours, suggests that Merovech was the son of Clodio, a semi-legendary Frankish king, who had extended Frankish control deep into Roman Gaul. Yet another tradition, whispered in later medieval accounts, speaks of something stranger, that Merovech's mother encountered a sea creature while bathing, and that the child who resulted carried within him a dual lineage, part human, part from this otherworldly being. This tale, often called the legend of the Kinotaur, offered more than a strange origin story. It served as a mythic explanation for the dynasty's aura of sacred kingship. By linking Merovech's bloodline to forces beyond the ordinary, it cast his descendants as rulers whose authority came not merely from conquest or inheritance, but from a cosmic mandate. In the worldview of the early Middle Ages, such stories were not dismissed as superstition. They were understood as meaningful truths, metaphors that gave shape to the unseen forces believed to govern human affairs. The sea creature, whether imagined as a bull, a fish, or something in between, symbolized the liminal space between the known and the unknown, between the land on which the Franks lived and the waters that carried the mysteries of life and death. To say that Merovech was born of both a king and a sea beast was to declare that the dynasty stood with one foot in the human world and another in the realm of the divine. This origin tale made the Merovingians not just another noble family, but a house whose authority flowed from something eternal. When Gregory of Tours wrote in the 6th century, he did not indulge deeply in these mythical details, but his silence itself suggests that his audience already knew the story. Gregory, as a Christian bishop, preferred to emphasize the piety and deeds of rulers like Clovis, rather than dwell on older pagan lore. Yet the persistence of the legend in oral traditions and later writings shows how important it was for the dynasty's image. In an age when royal power often relied on fragile alliances and shifting loyalties, the aura of a supernatural bloodline gave stability to the throne, convincing both warriors and priests that the king was not just first among equals but anointed by fate itself. Beyond the myth of Merovech's conception, there is the question of his historical role. Sources are scarce, fragmentary, and often contradictory. Some accounts describe him as a leader of the Salian Franks in the mid-5th century, possibly fighting alongside or against Roman generals in the turbulent years following the collapse of imperial authority in the west. His very name, Merovech, became the anchor for the dynasty's identity. To call them Merovingians was to tie every later king back to this figure, whose memory stood at the threshold of legend and history. In this way, Merovech functioned much like the eponymous founders of other great houses of antiquity, figures such as Romulus for Rome or Cadmus for Thebes, where the personal name became the seed of an entire civilization. The Franks of this period did not leave detailed chronicles of their own. What little we know comes from Roman and later Christian authors, who often viewed the tribes with suspicion, admiration, or both. To the Romans, the Franks were both allies and threats, soldiers who fought in imperial armies and raiders who crossed the Rhine to plunder Gaul. Yet by the time of Merovech and his descendants, the balance of power had shifted. Rome's decline created opportunities for ambitious leaders to carve out kingdoms of their own. In this shifting landscape, a dynasty with a powerful origin story could rally followers who craved stability in a world of collapsing order. The mythic sea beast tale also carried echoes of older Germanic and Celtic traditions. Across northern Europe, stories of semi-divine ancestors, of kings born from unions between humans and supernatural beings, were common. These myths provided legitimacy by connecting ruling families to the deep, mysterious forces of nature. In the case of the Merovingians, the association with water was especially potent. Water, in ancient symbolism, was life-giving, purifying, and dangerous. It flowed through the landscape of northern Gaul in the form of rivers like the Seine and the Meuse, which sustained agriculture and commerce but also brought floods and destruction. To claim descent from a being of the waters was to claim mastery over life's most vital and most unpredictable force. Archaeology provides another dimension to understanding these origins. Frankish graves from the 5th century, often richly furnished with weapons, jewellery and ornaments, reveal a warrior elite that valued both martial power and symbolic display. Among them, some burials stand out for their richness, such as those later associated with Merovingian rulers. Gold cloisonné brooches, intricately decorated swords, and elaborate horse trappings all suggest that these leaders presented themselves not just as chieftains of tribes, but as kings of a sacred order. The myth of Merovech, woven together with the splendour of these graves, created an image of kingship that was as much ritual as it was political. Merovech himself does not appear often in the surviving records, but his shadow looms large because of what came after him. His supposed son, or successor, Childeric I, emerges more clearly in the sources. Childeric's burial at Tournai, uncovered in the 17th century, revealed an astonishing array of treasures, including a golden signet ring inscribed with his name, weapons, coins, and even hundreds of small golden bees or cicadas that may have adorned his cloak. This find, though centuries later than Merovech's lifetime, offers material evidence of the grandeur claimed by the dynasty. If Childeric's wealth and symbolism were any reflection of his father's legacy, then Merovech was indeed remembered not just as a warrior, but as the progenitor of a line set apart. The transition from Merovech to Childeric, and then to Clovis, marks the shift from myth into firmer historical ground. Yet the mythic origins never fully disappeared. They lingered beneath the surface, shaping how the dynasty was remembered by later generations. Even as Christian chroniclers emphasised the baptism of Clovis and the dynasty's support of the church, the older pagan story of a sea-born ancestor still gave the line a mystical resonance. The long-haired kings, as the Merovingians were known, carried their hair as a symbol of this sacred lineage. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him of his legitimacy, for the hair represented not only royal dignity, but the divine essence inherited from Merovech's strange conception. This blending of myth and ritual reveals how early medieval kingship operated. Authority was never simply a matter of law or force. It required a constant reinforcement of symbols, stories, and ceremonies. The Merovingians understood this well. They used the tale of Merovech, the treasures buried with their ancestors, and the sacred rituals of hair and blood to maintain their position. In times of political upheaval, these symbols mattered as much as the outcome of battles. Merovech himself may have lived in the mid-5th century, perhaps around the time of Attila the Hun's invasions and the final collapse of Roman control in Gaul. Some sources suggest that he fought at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, where a coalition of Romans and their allies halted Attila's advance. If this is true, it places him directly in one of the most significant events of late antiquity. Whether fact or later embellishment, the idea that the ancestor of the Merovingians stood in opposition to the Huns only added to his stature. In the memory of the Franks, to fight at such a battle was to be part of the great turning points of history. The story of Merovech and his strange birth from the sea, his possible presence at battles alongside Romans and against Huns, and his role as progenitor of a dynasty, all formed a foundation that later rulers could not ignore. Even as historical memory became Christianized, and as bishops chronicled the deeds of kings in the language of faith, the old myth lay just beneath the surface, never entirely erased. The dynasty that bore his name would build kingdoms, convert nations, and shape the political landscape of Europe, but always with the aura of that ancient origin clinging to them. The world in which Merovech lived was a landscape of transition. Roman cities still stood, though their forums and baths were falling into ruin. Bishops presided over congregations, blending Roman administrative habits with the new authority of Christian ritual. Tribal leaders gathered warriors around them, competing for land and plunder. Into this mixture stepped a dynasty that carried the weight of myth and the promise of order. Merovech's name, echoing with the sound of the sea, marked the beginning of a lineage that would dominate Gaul for centuries, and from him would come Childeric, whose treasures proclaimed royal magnificence, and Clovis, whose conquests and conversion would shape the destiny of an entire continent. When the name of Clovis first appears in the sources, it does so with a weight of expectation, for he represents the moment when the Merovingian lineage moved from legend into the clear light of political history. If Merovech's story lies at the boundary of myth and memory, and if Childric's treasures speak of a ruler whose wealth and alliances established Frankish prestige, it is Clovis who transforms these beginnings into a true kingdom. His reign marks the foundation not only of the Merovingian dynasty and power, but of Francia itself, a realm that would stand at the root of medieval Europe. To follow the life of Clovis is to witness the birth of a political order that combined the remnants of Roman authority, the vitality of Germanic tribal power, and the new unifying force of Christianity. Clovis was born around 466, son of Childric the Fur and Basina, a woman whose own story reflects the shifting loyalties of the age. Basina is said to have left her husband, a king of Thuringia, to join Childric in Gaul, declaring boldly that she sought the most powerful man in the world and would have him for her mate. Such tales, preserved by chroniclers like Gregory of Tours, illustrate not only the personal drama of dynastic marriages, but the constant interplay between different Germanic peoples on the frontiers of the collapsing Roman world. The young Clovis inherited not just his father's throne at Tournai when Childric died in 481, but also the ambition to expand Frankish power beyond the scattered tribal holdings that had defined it for generations. The world into which Clovis stepped was fragmented and uncertain. The Roman Empire in the west had collapsed in 476, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in Italy. In Gaul, Roman authority had already crumbled, replaced by a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms: the Visigoths in the south, the Burgundians in the Rhone valley, the remnants of Roman control around Soissons, and smaller groups of Franks, Alemanni and others competing for land. Clovis inherited command over a relatively modest Frankish kingdom, centred in northern Gaul around modern-day Belgium and northern France. His task was to transform this foothold into supremacy, a task he approached with both military aggression and political cunning. One of his first major moves was against the Roman domain of Syagrius, often described as the King of the Romans, who controlled the region of Soissons. Though Syagrius styled himself as a Roman governor rather than a barbarian king, his authority was limited, and Clovis saw an opportunity. In 486, Clovis marched his forces southward and confronted Syagrius near Soissons. The battle ended in Clovis's favour, and Syagrius fled to the Visigoths, who soon surrendered him to the Franks. With Syagrius's defeat, Clovis absorbed his territories, extending Frankish control deep into the former Roman lands of northern Gaul. This victory was more than territorial. It signalled the end of Roman political independence in Gaul and the rise of the Franks as its new masters. The capture of Soissons is remembered in a famous anecdote about the spoils of war. Gregory of Tours recounts how the booty was divided among Clovis's warriors, but when the king desired a particular vase for himself, one soldier struck it with his axe, declaring that Clovis should receive only his fair share. Clovis accepted the slight in silence, but the following year, during a review of the troops, he struck the same soldier down with his axe, saying, "Thus did you to the vase at Soissons." Whether true or embellished, the story reveals much about the expectations of Frankish kingship. A ruler had to share the spoils with his warriors, for his authority rested on their loyalty. Yet he also had to maintain his personal dignity and ensure that no challenge went unanswered. Clovis's delayed vengeance illustrated his cunning. He could endure insult temporarily, but he never forgot, and he always restored his honour in the end. Having secured Soissons, Clovis turned his eyes to further expansion. He fought against neighbouring Frankish groups, consolidating Salian dominance over the wider Frankish confederation. He also forged alliances through marriage, most notably with Clotilde, a Burgundian princess who would become one of the most important figures in his life and reign. Their union was not simply dynastic, but ideological, for Clotilde was a Christian, raised in a family where the struggle between Arian and Catholic Christianity shaped political conflict. Through her, the seed was planted for Clovis's eventual conversion, a decision that would carry immense consequences for the future of the dynasty. Before his baptism, however, Clovis remained a pagan, adhering to the old Germanic traditions of his people. His campaigns brought him into conflict with other tribes and kingdoms, among them the Alemanni. The decisive battle came at Tolbiac, fought around 496 or 497, where Clovis's forces clashed with the Alemanni in a struggle for supremacy in the Rhineland. The battle began poorly for the Franks, and at this moment, Clovis is said to have made a vow. If the Christian God granted him victory, he would accept baptism. According to Gregory of Tours, Clovis cried out in desperation, invoking Christ as the God of Clotilde, and the tide of battle turned. The Alemanni king fell and his forces fled, leaving Clovis victorious. This moment, whether shaped by later Christian retelling or rooted in Clovis's genuine experience, became the turning point of his reign. Following his victory, he honoured his vow. Around 496, in Reims, under the guidance of Bishop Remigius, Clovis received baptism, along with 3,000 of his warriors. The baptism of Clovis was one of the most significant events of the early Middle Ages. Unlike many Germanic rulers who embraced Arian Christianity, Clovis accepted Catholic orthodoxy, aligning himself with the faith of the Roman Church. This decision set him apart from Visigothic, Ostrogothic, and Burgundian kings, whose adherence to Arianism created tension with their Catholic subjects. By becoming Catholic, Clovis won the support of the powerful bishops of Gaul and bound his dynasty to the spiritual authority of Rome. The baptism was also rich in symbolism. The oil said to have been miraculously provided from heaven to anoint him, linked Clovis's kingship to divine sanction. In the eyes of his followers and the Church, he was no longer merely a warlord who had seized Roman lands. He was a king anointed like the rulers of Israel in the Old Testament, a monarch chosen by God to lead his people. This religious legitimacy reinforced the sacred aura that the Merovingians had claimed since the legend of Merovech. Now, however, the sea-born myth was joined with Christian sacrament, creating a dual foundation of authority that combined pagan legacy and Christian destiny. After his conversion, Clovis pursued further campaigns that expanded his realm. He defeated the Burgundians, though not completely absorbing their kingdom, and later turned against the Visigoths. In 507, at the Battle of Vouillé, Clovis confronted Alaric II, king of the Visigoths, near Poitiers. With the support of the Catholic bishops, who favoured Clovis over the Arian Visigoth, the Franks prevailed. Alaric was killed, and Clovis seized control of Aquitaine, extending Frankish rule far into the south of Gaul. This victory cemented his status as the dominant ruler of the region, eclipsing rivals and making the Merovingian realm the central power of Gaul. Clovis's relationship with the Church continued to strengthen. He endowed churches, supported bishops, and used religion as a tool of governance, yet he remained ruthless in his pursuit of power. Gregory of Tours recounts how Clovis eliminated rival Frankish leaders, often through cunning and treachery. He invited them to feasts, only to have them killed, ensuring that no competitors remained to threaten his rule. Such acts may seem brutal, but they reflect the realities of early medieval kingship, where survival often depended on the removal of rivals. For Clovis, the consolidation of power required both the sword and the cross, both violence and sanctity. By the time of his death in 511, Clovis had transformed the Merovingians from a minor Frankish lineage into the rulers of a kingdom that stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. His capital at Paris symbolized the shift of power from the Roman south to the Frankish north. His adoption of Catholic Christianity gave him an alliance with the Church that would endure for centuries, while his victories secured the Franks as the new masters of Gaul. The dynasty that began with Merovech's mysterious birth now stood at the centre of European politics. Clovis's legacy was not only territorial, but institutional. Under his reign, the beginnings of Frankish law were codified, blending Roman legal traditions with Germanic customs. The Salic law, though developed over time, began to take shape in his era, establishing rules of inheritance, property and justice that reflected both tribal practices and the needs of a settled kingdom. This legal foundation would become central to Merovingian and later Carolingian governance. As his reign ended, the question of succession loomed. Following Frankish custom, his kingdom was divided among his 4 sons, setting the stage for generations of rivalry, partition, and civil war. Yet before entering that turbulent chapter, one must recognise what Clovis had accomplished. From the modest throne of Tournai, he had risen to become the master of Gaul, the anointed king of the Franks, and the founder of a dynasty that would dominate Europe for nearly 3 centuries. His story marks the moment when the Merovingians stepped fully into history, carrying with them both the myth of their origins and the authority of their baptism, shaping a kingdom that would define the Middle Ages. The baptism of Clovis stands as one of the turning points in the entire history of medieval Europe, not simply as a religious event, but as a transformation that altered politics, culture, and the very meaning of kingship. In an age when alliances shifted as quickly as campaigns could be mounted, when kingdoms rose and fell through the sword, Clovis's decision to abandon the gods of his ancestors and embrace the Christian faith placed the Merovingians on a unique trajectory. His conversion has been remembered, reinterpreted and mythologized in countless ways, yet at its core it was a moment when the Franks, who had emerged from tribal confederations into rulers of Gaul, stepped into the mainstream of Christian Europe. The story, preserved most vividly by Gregory of Tours, begins not in a church but on a battlefield. Around the year 496, Clovis faced the Alemanni at Tolbiac. The Alemanni were a powerful confederation of tribes in the Rhineland, and their strength posed a serious threat to Frankish expansion. The battle was fierce, and Clovis's forces began to falter. At this moment, according to Gregory, Clovis lifted his voice to the god of his wife, Clotilde. "If you grant me victory," he is said to have prayed, "I will believe in you and be baptized in your name." For Gregory, writing decades later, this was the decisive turning point. The Alemanni king fell in battle, their forces broke, and Clovis emerged victorious, his vow now binding him to the god he had invoked. Yet the road from vow to baptism was not immediate. For a pagan king ruling over warriors loyal to ancient traditions, conversion carried political risks as well as spiritual meaning. Clotilde, already a Christian, had long urged her husband to abandon the old gods. Her persistence, even before Tolbiac, reveals the depth of her influence. She had suffered personal loss within her own family at the hands of Arian relatives, and understood that Clovis's embrace of Catholic Christianity would not only secure his soul, but also strengthen his political alliances. It was her faith, as much as Clovis's battlefield experience, that set the stage for what followed. The act of baptism itself took place in Reims, under the guidance of Bishop Remigius, one of the most respected churchmen of his time. The scene, as described by Gregory, is filled with dramatic and symbolic detail. Clovis, dressed in white, approached the font, accompanied by a retinue of 3,000 of his warriors who also sought baptism. The church was prepared with candles and incense, creating an atmosphere of solemnity and awe. As Clovis entered the water, Remigius is said to have addressed him with words that echoed through the centuries. "Bend thy head, proud Sicambrian, burn what thou hast worshipped, worship what thou hast burned." This phrase, if authentic, captured the essence of the moment, a complete renunciation of the old gods and a total submission to the new faith. The ceremony carried immense symbolism. To be baptized was to be cleansed of sin, to enter into a new life, and for a king it meant that his rule itself became sanctified. The chroniclers spoke of a miraculous vessel, the holy ampulla, brought from heaven by a dove, containing the oil used to anoint Clovis. This detail, though likely a later addition, became central to French tradition, for the ampulla was preserved at Reims and used for the coronation of French kings until the Revolution. By linking Clovis's baptism to divine anointing, the story elevated his kingship from the realm of earthly power into that of sacred destiny. The decision to adopt Catholic Christianity, rather than the Arian form practiced by most other Germanic rulers, carried profound political consequences. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Burgundians and Vandals had all embraced Arianism, a theological position that denied the full divinity of Christ and placed them at odds with the Roman Church. This choice had created tension between Arian kings and their Catholic subjects. Clovis's baptism into Catholicism, by contrast, immediately aligned him with the majority of the population in Gaul who remained loyal to the Nicene Creed. It gave him the support of bishops who wielded immense influence in their cities, and it distinguished him from his rivals, casting him as the defender of true Christianity. This alignment with the Catholic Church transformed the Franks' role in Europe. Clovis was no longer merely one of many barbarian kings carving out dominions in the ruins of the empire. He became the champion of Catholic orthodoxy, a position that earned him recognition from the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, who saw in him a potential ally against both pagans and Arians. In 508, the emperor conferred upon Clovis the title of consul, a Roman dignity that symbolically tied him to the legacy of the Caesars. This blending of Roman authority and Christian sanctity created a foundation upon which medieval kingship would be built. The baptism also reshaped the relationship between king and people. In Frankish tradition, kingship had been bound to military success, to the distribution of booty, and to the charisma of leadership. Now a new element was added. The king was the chosen instrument of God, anointed to govern not only through strength, but through divine favour. This gave Clovis a tool of legitimacy that went beyond the battlefield. His authority was now sacral, and any opposition to him could be framed as opposition to God's will. For his subjects, this created a sense of stability. For a king bound to divine law offered more than mere brute force. He offered a connection to eternal order. The mass baptism of his warriors was equally significant. By bringing thousands of his followers into the church alongside him, Clovis ensured that his decision was not a solitary act but a communal transformation. The warriors who had once invoked the old gods before battle now carried the sign of the cross, their loyalty reinforced by a shared faith that bound them more tightly to their king. This unity proved invaluable in the years that followed, as Clovis continued his campaigns against Arian neighbours. The reaction of the Catholic bishops to Clovis's baptism was one of immense enthusiasm. They saw in him the hand of providence, a ruler who could protect and expand the church in a time of uncertainty. Gregory of Tours, writing a generation later, framed the event as the dawn of a new era, in which the Franks were chosen as the people of God, replacing the Romans as defenders of the faith. This narrative, though shaped by hindsight, reveals how deeply the baptism was woven into the identity of the Merovingians and their kingdom. Yet the decision to embrace Catholicism did not erase the complexities of Clovis's reign. He continued to act with the ruthlessness of a Frankish warlord, eliminating rivals and seizing territories. The church may have sanctified his kingship, but it did not soften his politics. In fact, the combination of Christian legitimacy and traditional violence made him all the more formidable. He could claim divine sanction for acts that were, in practice, cold strategies of power. When he moved against the Visigoths at Vouillé, when he manipulated the rivalries of the Burgundians, when he had Frankish nobles quietly assassinated to consolidate his rule, all of these actions could be framed as necessary for the defence of the Catholic faith and the stability of the realm. The baptism of Clovis also set in motion traditions that would echo throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The idea that a king was not merely chosen by his people, but consecrated by God became the cornerstone of monarchy. In France especially, the link between Clovis's baptism at Reims and the coronation of later kings at the same site created a line of continuity that stretched for more than 1,000 years. Each monarch who received the holy oil traced his legitimacy back to that day when the Merovingian king bent his head to the font. For Clovis himself, the baptism was both a personal turning point and a public spectacle. In the eyes of his subjects, it transformed him from a pagan warlord into a sacred monarch. In the eyes of the bishops, it made him the chosen defender of Catholic Gaul. In the eyes of rival kings, it marked him as a dangerous opponent, backed not only by armies but by the powerful machinery of the church. This combination of religion and politics, of faith and ambition, defined the remainder of his reign and set the stage for the Merovingian legacy. The image of Clovis at the font, surrounded by priests and warriors, remains one of the most iconic scenes of the early Middle Ages. It represents more than an individual's conversion. It represents the convergence of three traditions: the fading glory of Rome, the vitality of the Germanic tribes, and the universal authority of the Catholic Church. In the person of Clovis, these three strands were woven into a single fabric, creating a model of kingship that would endure for centuries. As the water of baptism washed over him, Clovis was not simply entering a new faith. He was laying the foundation of a kingdom that would outlast him, a dynasty that carried within its veins the mingling of myth and sacrament. From the sea-born Merovech to the warlord Childeric, the lineage had always carried an aura of destiny. With Clovis's baptism, that destiny was given a new shape, one that would transform Gaul into Francia and place the Merovingians at the heart of Christendom. And from this moment onward, the story of the dynasty cannot be told apart from the story of the Church, for the two became bound together in a bond that neither sword nor time could easily sever. The world that emerged in the wake of Clovis's victories and baptism was no longer simply a patchwork of tribes and provinces. It was beginning to cohere into a kingdom, a realm that needed more than the charisma of a warlord to endure. Francia, as it came to be called, was built from a mosaic of peoples, Roman and Frankish, Burgundian and Gallo-Roman, bishops and warriors, farmers and nobles. To bind them together required more than campaigns. It required law, ritual, and the careful balancing of traditions both old and new. The Merovingians, for all their reputation as long-haired kings bound to myth, proved capable of shaping a society that drew on Roman heritage, Germanic custom, and Christian faith to create something distinct. One of the most important steps in this process was the codification of law. Among the Franks, justice had long been rooted in custom, in unwritten traditions passed down through generations. These customs governed inheritance, property, compensation for injury, and the obligations of kinship. Under Clovis, these traditions were given written form in what became known as the Lex Salica, or Salic law. This was not a law code in the Roman sense, designed to apply universally and systematically across an empire. It was instead a collection of clauses, each prescribing the payment of fines for specific offences, reflecting the deep-rooted emphasis in Germanic culture on compensation and balance rather than abstract principles. The Salic law reveals much about the society over which Clovis ruled. Murder, theft, injury, insults, and even the cutting of a tree in another's land all carried specific penalties, usually expressed in terms of vergild, the payment owed to a victim or his kin. The amounts varied depending on status. The killing of a free Frank demanded one payment, while the killing of a Roman landholder might demand another. This differentiation reflects the multi-ethnic character of the kingdom, where Romans and Franks coexisted under one rule, but not always with equal standing. Yet by setting these customs in writing, Clovis began the process of creating a shared framework of justice that bound different groups together. Unlike Roman law, which emphasized the authority of the state to punish crimes, Salic law emphasized the restoration of peace within the community. The payment of fines prevented cycles of vengeance that could tear families and clans apart. In this way, law became a tool of stability, ensuring that disputes did not escalate endlessly. At the same time, the very act of codification asserted the king's authority. By sponsoring the law code, Clovis positioned himself not only as a war leader, but as the source of justice. To administer law was to govern not only bodies on the battlefield, but lives in villages and towns, a shift that made kingship more enduring. The role of the church in this process cannot be overstated. Bishops, now bound to Clovis through his baptism, provided literacy, administrative experience, and moral authority. Many had been trained in the Roman tradition, accustomed to recording charters, interpreting laws, and managing the affairs of large urban congregations. Their cooperation ensured that Frankish kingship acquired a written dimension, something more permanent than oral custom. In return, the bishops received royal protection and privileges, embedding the church deeply within the fabric of the kingdom. Francia thus became not merely a political entity but a sacred one, where divine and legal authority worked hand in hand. The shaping of Francia also depended on the integration of diverse peoples. The Franks themselves were a confederation, composed of different groups who had not always acted in unison. Clovis's conquest of rivals, sometimes through battle, sometimes through assassination, brought them under a single dynasty. Yet he also ruled over large populations of Gallo-Romans, descendants of those who had lived under the empire. These communities retained Roman customs, spoke Latin, and looked to bishops as their leaders. For them, Clovis's Catholic faith provided reassurance, for unlike the Arian rulers in neighbouring kingdoms, he had aligned himself with their creed. This created a bridge between Frankish warriors and Roman provincials, binding them in a shared identity as subjects of a Catholic king. Economically, Francia rested on the land. Agriculture provided the foundation of wealth, with estates worked by peasants forming the backbone of society. The Franks, like the Romans before them, understood the importance of controlling land and its produce. The distribution of land became a central feature of Merovingian rule, as kings rewarded loyal followers with estates taken from defeated enemies or granted from royal holdings. In this way, power was not only military but territorial, rooted in the capacity to provide for warriors and their households. Over time, this practice would evolve into the networks of patronage and vassalage that defined medieval feudalism, but in the days of Clovis, it remained a direct means of securing loyalty. The royal court, though not yet fixed in one place, served as the centre of political life. Kings moved from city to city, holding assemblies, issuing judgments, and receiving tribute. Paris, where Clovis eventually established his capital, symbolised the transition from Roman to Frankish rule. Once a Roman city, with walls, churches, and administrative structures, it became the seat of a Frankish king, blending old and new. From here, Clovis and his successors could project authority over a realm that stretched from the Loire to the Rhine, from the North Sea to the Pyrenees. The rituals of kingship reinforced this authority. Merovingian kings were known for their long hair, a visible sign of their sacred status. Unlike other warriors, who might cut their hair as a sign of discipline, the king's flowing locks marked him as untouchable. To cut a king's hair was to strip him of legitimacy, a punishment sometimes inflicted on rivals to render them unfit for rule. Alongside this symbol, the Christian sacrament of anointing now sanctified the king's body, blending Germanic and Christian traditions into a single image of sacral monarchy. Assemblies of warriors and nobles also played a role in shaping the kingdom. These gatherings, where laws were proclaimed and decisions announced, reflected the Frankish tradition of consultation, yet the ultimate authority lay with the king. By presiding over assemblies, distributing gifts, and ensuring justice, the king reinforced his position as the centre of unity. Over time, these assemblies would become more formalised, but in the early Merovingian period, they remained gatherings where military, legal, and religious authority converged. The shaping of Francia was not only a matter of law and ritual, but of memory. Chroniclers like Gregory of Tours framed Clovis as a new Constantine, a ruler whose conversion brought salvation to his people and whose victories established a Christian kingdom. This narrative, though written decades later, reveals how quickly the dynasty became entwined with sacred history. To remember Clovis was to remember not only battles and conquests, but the dawn of a new order, one in which the Franks replaced the Romans as defenders of faith and civilization. Yet beneath the grand narratives, daily life in Francia was marked by continuity as well as change. Farmers tilled the same fields their ancestors had, towns continued to host markets and gatherings, and local aristocrats maintained influence through landholding and patronage. What had shifted was the overarching framework. Where once a distant Roman governor had claimed authority, now a Frankish king stood, supported by bishops and bound by the customs of his people. This blending of Roman administration, Frankish tradition, and Christian symbolism created a society that was neither wholly Roman nor wholly Germanic, but something new, something distinctly Frankish. As the first generation of Merovingian rule unfolded, the balance between peoples, laws, and power created a foundation upon which future kings would build. The kingdom Clovis had forged through battle was now given form through justice, ritual, and memory. Francia was more than a territory. It was becoming an identity, one that would endure through centuries of conflict and transformation. When Clovis died in 511, he left behind not only a vast kingdom stretching from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, but also a dynasty whose future would depend on the uncertain balance between tradition and ambition. In Frankish custom, kingship was not conceived as a single, indivisible crown passed to a sole heir. Instead, it was treated as patrimony, land that could be divided among sons like any other inheritance. This practice of partible succession, deeply rooted in Germanic tradition, ensured that each son of a king would rule as king in his own right. Yet it also guaranteed that the unity Clovis had so ruthlessly achieved would fracture into competing realms, each with its own court, ambitions, and rivalries. Clovis had 4 surviving sons: Theuderic, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar. Each received a portion of the kingdom, though the division was not equal in size or strength. Theuderic, the eldest, born of a concubine before Clovis's marriage to Clotilde, received the lands of Reims, including much of the old Roman heartland of northeastern Gaul. Clodomir was given Orléans and the Loire Valley, a fertile and strategic region. Childebert ruled from Paris, the city that Clovis had made his capital, and Clothar, the youngest, inherited Soissons and the northern domains that had been central to Frankish power from the start. Together these 4 sons ruled a kingdom that was still thought of as a single Frankish realm, yet in practice was now a quartet of allied but competing dominions. The division of the realm did not immediately destroy the unity of the dynasty. The brothers often acted together, especially in campaigns against external enemies, bound by shared blood and the understanding that their strength depended on cooperation. Yet beneath the surface lay inevitable tensions. Each brother sought to expand his share at the expense of the others, and the constant possibility of treachery or betrayal shaped their dealings. The kingdom of the Franks became not one throne but several, each with a long-haired king presiding over warriors, bishops and nobles who weighed their loyalties carefully. The first major challenge to their cooperation came with the question of Burgundy. This neighbouring kingdom, ruled by the descendants of Gundobad, was weakened by internal strife and became a tempting target for the sons of Clovis. In 523, the brothers, urged on by their mother Clotilde, who harboured a deep desire for vengeance against Burgundy for the killing of her parents, launched a joint campaign. Clodomir, Childebert and Clothar marched against King Sigismund of Burgundy, captured him, and eventually had him killed along with his family. The brutality of this act reflected the merciless politics of the age, where dynastic rivalries were often settled with executions rather than negotiations. The war against Burgundy did not end there. In 524, Clodomir led another expedition, only to be defeated and killed at the Battle of Vézérance. His death left his young sons as heirs, but in the ruthless logic of Merovingian succession, their uncles soon moved to eliminate them. Clothar and Childebert seized the boys and, despite their grandmother Clotilde's protests, had them murdered, consolidating Clodomir's share of the realm between themselves. Only one child, Clodoald, survived by escaping into monastic life, later venerated as Saint Cloud. This episode reveals the brutal reality of Merovingian politics. Kinship bound the dynasty together, but ambition drove its members to kill even their own nephews in the pursuit of power. With Clodomir gone, the balance of power shifted among the remaining brothers. Theuderic, as the eldest, commanded respect and led campaigns into Thuringia and against other eastern neighbours. His realm, centred on Reims, maintained close connections with the Rhineland and the lands of the former Roman administration. Childebert, ruling from Paris, sought influence in Aquitaine and the west, often in rivalry with the Visigoths, while Clothar, with his base in Soissons, positioned himself as an ambitious opportunist, always ready to seize advantage when circumstances allowed. Despite their rivalries, the brothers continued to cooperate in campaigns against external enemies. They launched expeditions into Spain against the Visigoths, seeking to expand Frankish influence beyond the Pyrenees. They pressed further into Burgundy, gradually weakening its independence. They also continued to confront the Saxons, Alemanni and other tribes along the eastern frontiers. Through these campaigns, the Frankish realm expanded, though always under the shifting leadership of whichever brother could command the most resources and loyalty at the moment. The division of the realm did not mean division of identity. The Franks continued to see themselves as one people under the Merovingian line. The kings might quarrel and even kill one another's heirs, but their authority still derived from the same source, the blood of Clovis and the sacred legitimacy of the dynasty. This shared identity prevented the realm from dissolving into unrelated petty kingdoms. Instead, it functioned as a family enterprise, divided but interconnected, its unity fragile but persistent. The role of queens and royal women also grew in importance during this period. Clotilde, though widowed, remained a powerful figure, urging her sons to avenge family wrongs and influencing their campaigns. Other royal women forged alliances through marriage, connecting the Merovingians to neighbouring dynasties and embedding them in the wider network of European politics. In a world where succession often depended on lineage, the marriages of royal women were as crucial as the battles of kings. The partition of the realm also shaped the administration of Francia. Each king established his own court, gathering nobles, bishops and warriors who formed the backbone of governance. These courts became centres of patronage, where loyalty was rewarded with land, offices or gifts. The duplication of courts across the divided kingdoms ensured that Merovingian power was dispersed yet resilient. Even when one branch faltered, another could continue, preserving the dynasty as a whole. The constant division and redivision of territory created a dynamic political landscape. When one king died, his lands were divided among his sons, and when those sons died, their uncles or cousins might seize control. This cycle produced instability but also prevented the permanent consolidation of power under a single ruler, ensuring that the Merovingian realm remained a family of kings rather than a centralised monarchy. The long-haired kings were many, but they all carried the same lineage, a fact that both united and divided them. The story of the sons of Clovis reveals the paradox at the heart of Merovingian politics. The dynasty's strength lay in its sacred lineage, which bound its members together as a ruling family, yet its weakness lay in the tradition of dividing lands among heirs, which set brothers against brothers and uncles against nephews. This cycle of unity and division would define the Merovingians for generations, creating both the resilience and the fragility of their kingdom. By the middle of the 6th century, Francia was no longer the singular creation of Clovis, but a realm shaped by his heirs' ambitions, rivalries and conquests. The kingdom had expanded, its institutions had grown more complex, and its identity as a Catholic power had deepened. Yet beneath it all, the shadow of division lingered. ensuring that the story of the Merovingians would be one of both greatness and fragmentation, of a dynasty that could never wholly unite itself even as it ruled over much of Western Europe. The Merovingian world was a society in which kingship carried sacred significance, in which warriors determined the fate of kingdoms through battle, and in which dynastic legitimacy was bound to blood. Yet behind the armour and the sword, the figure of the queen shaped this order in profound ways. Royal women were not passive figures, consigned only to the domestic sphere. They were dynastic architects, mothers of heirs, mediators between rival factions, and at times ruthless players in the brutal politics of succession. In the early generations after Clovis, their influence can be seen everywhere, in the forging of alliances, in the survival of bloodlines, and in the struggles that determined the future of Francia. To speak of Merovingian politics without them would be to miss half the story. Clotilde, the widow of Clovis, stands at the centre of this transition. Her marriage to Clovis had carried enormous symbolic and political weight, for she was Catholic at a time when many Germanic queens were Arian. Her persistence in pressing her husband toward conversion, her role in raising their children, and her influence over them after Clovis's death all demonstrate the centrality of queenship in shaping the dynasty. When her sons inherited their father's realm, it was Clotilde who urged them into action against Burgundy, invoking the blood of her murdered parents and brothers to demand vengeance. In her, dynastic politics and personal vendetta became indistinguishable, for her appeals to her sons combined family loyalty with political advantage. The wars against Burgundy cannot be understood without her hand behind them. Clotilde's story also reveals the ambiguous position of queenship. As queen mother, she wielded influence, but she was not immune to being ignored when her wishes clashed with her son's ambitions. When Clodomir's children were placed in her care after his death, she sought to protect them, but her pleas fell on deaf ears as Clothar and Childebert seized and murdered the boys. The horror of this act, carried out in her presence, underscored the brutal reality of succession politics, where even the prayers of a queen mother could not prevent the bloodshed demanded by ambition. Yet her survival and continued veneration, later as a saint, shows how royal women could embody both the tragic cost of dynastic rivalry and the enduring sanctity of the royal line. Beyond Clotilde, the daughters of the Merovingian house also played critical roles. Marriage was a weapon as potent as any sword, binding the dynasty to allies across Europe. A daughter might be given in marriage to a Visigothic, Burgundian, or Lombard king, creating a bond that could either stabilise a border or provide a pretext for intervention when disputes arose. These marriages ensured that the Merovingians were woven into the wider network of European dynasties, their blood mingling with that of rival houses. For the women themselves, marriage meant leaving their homeland to become symbols of Frankish power in foreign courts, yet it also offered them a chance to shape politics in those distant realms. Within the Frankish kingdom itself, queens consort exercised influence in court politics. They managed royal households, distributed patronage, and cultivated relationships with bishops and nobles. Their positions were precarious, dependent on the favour of their husbands and the survival of their sons, yet they could also wield remarkable power when circumstances aligned. A queen whose son inherited the throne could become regent, governing in his name until he came of age, and in such moments the true extent of female authority was revealed. The most striking example of this dynamic appears in the story of Brunhild and Fredegund, two queens whose rivalry defined Merovingian politics for decades. Brunhild was a Visigothic princess, married to King Sigeberta of Austrasia, while Fredegund began her career as a servant at court before becoming the mistress, and later the Queen of Chilperic the Ward of Neustria. Their conflict was not merely personal, but dynastic, shaping the course of wars, alliances, and assassinations that spanned generations. Brunhild brought with her a sense of Roman dignity and political acumen, and as queen she quickly became a formidable figure in Austrasia. When her husband was murdered at the instigation of Fredegund, She did not retreat into obscurity but fought to preserve her son's inheritance, acting as regent and commanding loyalty from nobles and bishops. Fredegund, by contrast, embodied the cunning and ruthlessness often associated with court intrigue. She manoeuvred her way from concubine to queen, orchestrating the removal of rivals and consolidating her husband's authority in Neustria. The two women became symbols of competing courts, their enmity spilling into open warfare as their sons and grandsons carried forward their struggle. Their rivalry illustrates the degree to which queenship in the Merovingian world was not confined to ceremonial roles. Brunhild directed armies, reformed administration, and even involved herself in ecclesiastical politics, appointing bishops and shaping the spiritual life of her realm. Fredegund, though less inclined toward reform, wielded assassination as a political tool, eliminating enemies with calculated efficiency. Between them, they demonstrated that queens could command the same mixture of violence, diplomacy, and charisma as their male counterparts. The bloodlines that flowed through these queens also mattered profoundly. In a dynasty where legitimacy was tied to descent from Clovis and the sacred aura of the Merovingian name, the role of queens as mothers of heirs was central. A queen who bore sons secured her position, one who did not risk being discarded or replaced. The survival of dynasties depended on the fertility of queens, and the politics of reproduction shaped the ambitions of entire kingdoms. When disputes arose over inheritance, the maternal lineage of claimants often determined the strength of their claims. In this sense, queenship was as biological as it was political, for the womb became a site of dynastic contest. Even beyond the battlefield and the court, queens influenced the cultural landscape of Francia. They were patrons of churches and monasteries, donors of relics, and participants in the spread of Christianity. Their piety, recorded in hagiographies and chronicles, reinforced the sacred legitimacy of the dynasty. A queen who endowed a monastery or commissioned a church not only demonstrated personal devotion, but bound her family to the spiritual authority of the church. In this way, queens became mediators between the sacred and the political, embodying the fusion of dynasty and religion that defined the Merovingian order. The stories of Clotilde, Brunhild, and Fredegund reveal both the possibilities and the dangers of queenship. These women could shape kingdoms, wage wars, and alter the course of dynastic history, but they also lived under constant threat. To fail as a queen was to risk exile, imprisonment, or even execution, for the stakes of power were high and the margins of safety narrow. Their prominence in the chronicles reflects not only their extraordinary actions, but the central role of royal women in sustaining and contesting the fragile balance of power in the Frankish realm. Merovingian queenship, then, was not a secondary role but an essential one. Through marriage, motherhood, regency, and rivalry, queens ensured the continuation of bloodlines, the formation of alliances, and the survival of kingdoms. They were the custodians of legitimacy and the architects of dynastic memory, figures who stood at the intersection of family and politics, religion and power. In their hands, the fragile threads of succession and stability were woven, sometimes tightly, sometimes fatally torn apart. As the Merovingian dynasty advanced through the 6th century, the presence of powerful queens guaranteed that its politics would never be solely a matter of kings and their swords. It would always also be a story of women who fought with subtler weapons, who ruled through sons and grandsons, who forged bonds through marriage and shattered them through vendetta. In their lives and struggles, the human drama of the dynasty is laid bare, showing how the shaping of Francia depended as much on the power of queens as on the ambitions of kings. The Merovingian dynasty could not have endured, nor could the Frankish kingdom have taken on the form it did, without the powerful partnership it forged with the church. The baptism of Clovis had signalled more than the king's personal conversion. It had opened the way for bishops and Christian institutions to become pillars of the new realm. In Gaul, where centuries of Roman rule had left behind a network of cities, dioceses, and Christian communities, The bishops were the figures who provided continuity between the fallen empire and the emerging Frankish order. They were not only spiritual leaders but also guardians of memory, managers of wealth, and mediators between kings and people. Their influence reached into every corner of Merovingian politics and society, shaping the kingdom as much as warriors and kings. In the late Roman world, bishops had come to occupy an unusual position. As imperial structures decayed, it was often the bishop who took responsibility for protecting the population, organising defences, feeding the poor, and negotiating with invading armies. In Gaul, this tradition endured into the Merovingian period. A bishop was not merely a man of prayer. He was a civic leader, rooted in his city, carrying authority that blended spiritual and temporal responsibilities. When the Franks entered these cities and assumed power, they inherited not only walls and marketplaces but also the authority of the bishop, whose loyalty was indispensable. The Frankish kings understood this immediately. Clovis himself had cultivated relationships with bishops such as Remigius of Reims, whose role in his baptism symbolized the union of dynasty and church. By aligning himself with the Catholic bishops, Clovis distinguished himself from Arian rulers in neighbouring kingdoms and secured the support of the majority of his subjects, who already professed Nicene Christianity. This alliance was more than symbolic. Bishops provided legitimacy to the Merovingians, portraying them in chronicles and sermons as chosen by God, defenders of the true faith, and heirs to the Roman legacy. The bishops also served as practical administrators. They were among the few figures in the realm who possessed literacy, trained in the traditions of late Roman education. They could draft charters, record transactions, and preserve law codes. Their scribes kept alive the culture of writing that allowed the kingdom to function in ways beyond oral tradition. In royal courts, bishops often acted as counsellors, drafting legal decrees or advising on matters of governance. In assemblies, their voices carried moral weight, lending divine sanction to political decisions. This partnership allowed the Merovingians to extend their authority over populations far larger and more diverse than the warrior elite that had originally followed them. The wealth of the church further enhanced its role. Bishops controlled estates, donations, and revenues from their dioceses. Churches and monasteries became centres of economic power, accumulating lands that produced food, wine, and resources. This wealth was not only spiritual but material, enabling the church to support the poor, fund building projects, and maintain the clergy. For kings, the patronage of churches was a way of binding bishops to their cause. A gift of land to a church ensured prayers for the donor's soul, but also tied a powerful bishop more closely to the dynasty. This exchange of wealth for loyalty created a network of obligations that paralleled, and often overlapped with, the bonds between kings and their warriors. The bishops also functioned as mediators in times of conflict. When civil wars erupted among the sons and grandsons of Clovis, bishops often stepped forward as negotiators, attempting to prevent bloodshed or to reconcile factions. Their spiritual authority allowed them to act as figures above dynastic quarrels, though in practice many bishops were deeply entangled in politics. They were drawn from the aristocracy, their families connected to the nobility, and their loyalties reflected the shifting alliances of the realm. Yet even when partisan, their public role as shepherds of their flocks gave them influence that kings could not ignore. One of the most striking examples of the Church's role in the Merovingian world is Gregory of Tours, whose writings provide much of what we know about this period. As Bishop of Tours in the late 6th century, Gregory was both a spiritual leader and a political figure, deeply involved in the struggles between Brunhild and Fredegund, the rival queens. His history of the Franks is as much a chronicle of dynastic feuds as it is a theological narrative, portraying events through the lens of divine providence. Gregory's work demonstrates how bishops shaped memory as well as politics, framing the Merovingians as chosen instruments of God even as he condemned their violence and immorality. His authority as a bishop gave him the standing to critique kings, though always within the framework of loyalty to the dynasty. The Church also shaped daily life in Francia. Bishops and priests presided over the sacraments that mark the rhythm of existence: baptism at birth, marriage, confession, Eucharist, and burial. Churches were centres of community, where liturgy, festivals, and processions bound people together in shared ritual. Monasteries, though still developing in this early period, provided spaces for prayer, learning, and preservation of texts. The spread of Christian devotion helped integrate the diverse populations of the kingdom, offering a shared faith that transcended ethnic divisions. The authority of the bishops, however, was not uncontested. Kings sought to control the appointment of bishops, ensuring that loyal men filled these powerful offices. Noble families also vied to place their relatives in episcopal sees, turning bishoprics into prizes of political competition. This sometimes led to conflicts between local communities, noble factions, and royal authority. Yet even in these disputes, the centrality of bishops was reinforced, for no settlement could be reached without considering their influence. The blending of sacred and secular in the figure of the bishop also created tensions. Bishops were expected to embody Christian humility and spiritual dedication, yet they lived as aristocrats, managing estates, commanding wealth, and engaging in politics. Critics sometimes accused them of corruption, worldliness, or ambition, but the realities of their role made such involvement inevitable. The Merovingian kingdom was not a state in the modern sense, but a network of personal bonds, and bishops, as both religious leaders and aristocrats, were integral to its operation. The construction of churches and monasteries during this period also reveals the intertwining of dynasty and church. Kings and queens endowed churches as acts of piety, but also as monuments of power. The building of the great church of St. Martin in Tours, for example, reinforced the cult of a saint whose shrine attracted pilgrims from across Gaul. By associating themselves with such sites, Merovingian rulers drew on the sanctity of saints to enhance their own legitimacy. Queens, too, were active patrons, funding foundations that ensured prayers for their families and linked their names to holy places. The relationship between kings and bishops was not always harmonious. At times, bishops resisted royal commands when they believed them unjust or contrary to divine law. In such moments, the Church demonstrated its capacity to act as a check on royal power, though this resistance was usually framed in moral rather than political terms. A king who defied the Church risked alienating not only bishops but the broader Christian community, undermining the sacred foundation of his rule. The balance between cooperation and conflict defined the ongoing negotiation of power between throne and altar. As the Merovingian dynasty moved into the later 6th and 7th centuries, the role of the Church only deepened. The rise of monasticism, the spread of cults of saints, and the growing wealth of ecclesiastical institutions made bishops even more central to the functioning of the realm. Their writings preserved the memory of kings and queens, their rituals sanctified the dynasty, and their lands and resources sustained armies and courts. In many ways, the Merovingian kingdom was as much a bishop's kingdom as a king's. The story of the Merovingians, then, is inseparable from the story of the Church in Gaul. The kings provided armies and dynastic legitimacy. The bishops provided literacy, continuity, and sanctity. Together they forged a realm that carried forward elements of Rome, reshaped them with Frankish custom, and infused them with Christian meaning. The long-haired kings and the mitred bishops were partners in power, their relationship at times tense, at times cooperative, but always essential to the survival and identity of Francia. Dagobert occupies a unique place in the history of the Merovingian kings. He was not the first ruler to consolidate power, nor the last to wear the long hair that marked sacred kingship. But in his reign, the dynasty reached a level of stability and grandeur that would later be remembered as its golden age. He inherited the traditions of Clovis, the expansions of his predecessors, and the political networks that had been shaped by bishops, queens, and noble families. Yet unlike many of the rulers before and after him, Dagobert was able to bind these elements together into a kingdom that for a time looked truly unified, prosperous, and commanding. His reign in the first half of the 7th century offers a rare moment when the Merovingian monarchy stood not as a family of rival kings, but as a single throne radiating authority across Francia. Dagobert was the son of Clovis I, a ruler who had himself managed to restore unity after decades of dynastic rivalry. Clovis had presided over the famous Edict of Paris in 614, a decree that recognised the rights of nobles and bishops while asserting the authority of the king. This edict was not merely a political compromise, it reflected the growing awareness that for the dynasty to endure, the cooperation of aristocracy and church was essential. Dagobert grew up in this environment, witnessing first-hand the delicate balance between royal power, noble privilege, and episcopal influence. When he ascended to the throne, he carried forward this balance with remarkable skill, building a reign that was remembered even by later chroniclers as a high point of Merovingian rule. From the beginning of his reign, Dagobert demonstrated the ability to centralise authority. He was the first Merovingian king to establish Paris firmly as his capital, turning the city into the political heart of the realm. In this, he symbolised a shift from the itinerant courts of earlier kings, who moved constantly from city to city. Paris, with its Roman walls, its strategic location on the Seine, and its association with Clovis and the dynasty's sacred history, became the seat of power. From Paris, Dagobert presided over his court, administered justice, and projected an image of kingship that combined Roman heritage with Frankish tradition. Dagobert's court itself reflected the wealth and splendour of the dynasty. Chronicles describe a household filled with gold, silver, and treasures, adorned with fine cloth, and attended by a multitude of servants and officials. The king distributed gifts lavishly, rewarding loyalty and binding nobles to his service. In an age where gift-giving was a central mechanism of politics, Dagobert excelled in the art of patronage. His generosity enhanced his reputation and ensured that his authority was respected not only through fear, but through admiration. To belong to Dagobert's court was to be at the centre of power, enjoying both material reward and the prestige of royal favour. Dagobert's reign also marked a flourishing of law and justice. He inherited the Salic law and its tradition of codified fines and compensations, but he also issued new decrees that reflected the changing needs of the realm. He is remembered in later accounts as a just king, one who held court personally and listened to the complaints of his subjects. The imagery of the king as a judge sitting in public to dispense justice was deeply rooted in Germanic custom, and Dagobert embodied it with particular vigour. His judgments not only resolved disputes, but reinforced the authority of the monarchy, reminding all that the king stood at the centre of order in a world where violence and rivalry threatened stability. The church remained a crucial partner in his reign, and Dagobert cultivated close relationships with bishops and monastic leaders. He was a generous patron of monasteries, donating lands and wealth to foundations that not only prayed for his soul, but also acted as centres of literacy and administration. The most famous of these was the Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris, which Dagobert endowed lavishly. Saint-Denis became the burial place of the king, and in time it would grow into the necropolis of French monarchs for centuries to come. By associating himself with this powerful shrine, Dagobert ensured that his memory was bound to a sacred place, his dynasty entwined with the cult of a saint who symbolised divine protection for the Frankish people. Dagobert's reign was not confined to the core of Francia. He extended his influence across the borders, asserting Frankish authority over neighbouring peoples. Campaigns against the Saxons, Alemanni and other tribes reinforced the power of the dynasty and extracted tribute that enriched the royal treasury. His authority reached deep into Aquitaine and even into parts of Spain, though always through the shifting alliances and contested borders that characterised the period. What mattered was not the permanent conquest of distant lands, but the demonstration that the Merovingian king could summon armies, demand tribute, and stand as the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. One of Dagobert's most significant achievements was his handling of the eastern regions of the realm, particularly Austrasia. Traditionally, the Eastern Kingdom had its own identity, with powerful nobles and a warrior aristocracy that did not always submit easily to the authority of kings based in Neustria or Paris. Dagobert, recognising this, appointed his young son Sigibert as king of Austrasia, ruling under his father's authority, while keeping local nobles invested in the dynasty. This arrangement preserved unity while acknowledging the distinct traditions of Austrasia, demonstrating Dagobert's skill in managing the delicate balance of regional power. The image of Dagobert as a strong and capable ruler is reinforced by the way later generations remembered him. Medieval chroniclers, writing centuries after his death, recalled him as a figure of justice and prosperity, a model of kingship against which later rulers were measured. This memory was not accidental. Dagobert's reign genuinely marked a high point in the ability of the Merovingians to control their kingdom, to command respect from nobles, to cooperate with the church, and to display the wealth and magnificence that made kingship seem sacred and enduring. Yet even in this golden moment, the seeds of decline were present. Dagobert's reliance on powerful officials, particularly the mayors of the palace, foreshadowed the shift of power that would eventually undermine the dynasty. These officials, originally household managers, grew in influence as they administered estates, led armies, and managed the daily business of governance. Under Dagobert, they served as loyal instruments of royal authority, but in later generations they would become the true power behind the throne, reducing the kings to ceremonial figures. Dagobert's success thus carried within it the structures that would later contribute to Merovingian weakness. The personal character of Dagobert also contributed to his legacy. He was remembered as a king who enjoyed splendour, feasting and luxury, yet he was also a ruler who understood the responsibilities of kingship. Tales of his judgments, his generosity and his piety circulated widely, reinforcing the image of a ruler who combined worldly magnificence with sacred duty. His burial at Saint-Denis, in a church he had richly endowed, symbolised the culmination of his reign, a king resting beside a saint, his dynasty enshrined in the sacred heart of Francia. The reign of Dagobert I then represents the moment when the Merovingian monarchy shone brightest. It was a reign that bound together the legacies of Clovis, the power of the bishops, the traditions of Frankish law, and the grandeur of royal court life into a vision of kingship that later generations would look back on with nostalgia. Francia under Dagobert was not without its tensions, its rivalries, or its violence, but it was a kingdom where the king's authority was visible, respected, and effective. In the long history of the dynasty, it stands as a golden interlude before the slow erosion of power that would follow. The world of the Merovingian kings cannot be understood only through battles, alliances, and decrees. The substance of their rule also lived in the places they inhabited, the ceremonies they enacted, and the courtly life that surrounded them. A king's court was both a household and a government, a stage on which power was performed, and a hub where decisions were made. To imagine the Merovingian dynasty at its height is to picture not only warriors gathered for campaigns, but nobles, clerics, and servants assembled in palaces where ritual and daily routine gave shape to the authority of the long-haired kings. The Merovingian court was not confined to a single palace. Kings maintained multiple residences across their realm, moving from one to another with the seasons or the demands of politics. These palaces were not monumental stone castles in the medieval sense, but rather Roman villas adapted to royal use, or newly built complexes of wood and stone that combined grandeur with practicality. In Paris, Soissons, Metz, and other cities, kings presided from residences that included great halls for assemblies, chapels for worship, and chambers for the royal household. The movement of the king from palace to palace was itself a statement of power, reminding subjects that authority was not distant but present in their own lands when the royal court arrived. At the heart of the court stood the Great Hall, where the king received guests, held councils and dispensed justice. This was the visible theatre of kingship, where nobles came to affirm loyalty, where disputes were heard, and where ambassadors from distant lands presented gifts. The king sat on an elevated seat, adorned in fine garments, surrounded by symbols of wealth and power. The long hair of the Merovingian kings, carefully maintained, was itself a sign of sacred legitimacy, a physical mark that distinguished the royal body from ordinary men. Every appearance in the hall reinforced this sacred distinction, making the court a place where ritual elevated kingship into something more than political authority. Daily life in the court revolved around a mixture of solemn ceremony and practical governance. In the mornings, audiences were held where petitioners presented cases and disputes. The king's role as judge was central, for justice was a visible expression of his rule. These sessions could last for hours, filled with nobles, bishops, and commoners seeking decisions. Afternoons often saw councils with advisers, discussions of campaigns, or negotiations with envoys. Evenings were given to feasting, where the king displayed his wealth through banquets of meat, bread, wine, and music. Feasts were not mere indulgence but political theatre, binding the nobility to the king through shared consumption and gift-giving. The household of the king was vast and structured, with officials who managed every aspect of daily life and governance. The major domus, or mayor of the palace, supervised the administration, commanding servants, managing estates, and increasingly influencing politics. Beneath him were officials responsible for the treasury, the stables, the kitchens, and the armoury. Each office was filled with nobles or loyal retainers, creating a network of dependents that tied aristocratic families directly to the court. For ambitious men, service in the royal household was a path to influence, and competition for these positions was fierce. Queens and royal women also shaped the life of the court. A queen presided over her own household, managing attendance, overseeing the upbringing of children, and serving as patroness of churches and monasteries. She appeared beside the king in ceremonies, reinforcing the sanctity of the dynasty. In some cases, such as Brunhild or Fredegund, queens dominated the court, directing politics and wielding influence over nobles and bishops alike. Even when less politically active, queens were essential to the rituals of the household, embodying continuity and dynastic legitimacy through their presence. Religious life permeated the court, with chapels serving as spaces for daily prayer and liturgy. Bishops and priests attached to the court celebrated Mass, blessed campaigns, and offered counsel. Saints' relics, often carried into palaces, reinforced the aura of sanctity surrounding the dynasty. The intertwining of ritual and politics was constant. For every feast day, procession, or blessing of arms connected the king's authority to divine approval. The court was not merely secular power, but a place where the sacred and the political merged seamlessly. The wealth of the court was displayed not only in ceremonies but in material culture. Merovingian kings and queens adorned themselves in garments of silk, embroidered with gold, decorated with precious stones. Their treasuries contained golden vessels, jewelled reliquaries, and ornate weapons. Such objects were not simply for private enjoyment, they were tools of rule. Gifts of jewellery, weapons, or horses bestowed on nobles bound them to the king, and the very sight of these treasures demonstrated the prosperity of the realm. Burials of nobles from this period, with swords, brooches, and gold coins, reveal the extent to which wealth was expected as a marker of status, much of it circulating from the royal court outward. Feasting held a central place in the rhythm of the court. Chronicles describe tables laden with roasted meats, bread baked in the Roman tradition, an amphorae of wine brought from distant vineyards. Music accompanied the banquets, with harps and horns played by attendants. while poets or chroniclers recited tales of ancestors and victories. The king moved among his guests, distributing gifts or rewarding loyalty. Feasts were moments of both celebration and politics, where bonds of loyalty were renewed, alliances cemented, and the image of royal magnificence reinforced before the eyes of all who attended. The court also functioned as a place of law-giving. Kings issued decrees, confirmed charters, and enacted judgments within the palace walls. These acts were often witnessed by assembled nobles and bishops, whose presence gave legitimacy to royal decisions. Charters survive bearing the names of kings and the signatures of witnesses, showing the administrative machinery that radiated outward from the court. In this sense, the palace was not simply a residence, but the centre of government, where law, ritual, and daily management converged. The itinerant nature of the court gave it a dynamic rhythm. Kings did not stay long in one palace, but moved continually through their domains, bringing the court to different regions. This mobility allowed the monarchy to maintain contact with distant lands, to assert presence in places where loyalty might waver, and to ensure that royal authority was not confined to a single city. Each arrival of the king's household was a major event, filling the host city with pageantry and burden. For the feeding and housing of the court demanded resources but also brought prestige. Children and education were also part of court life. The sons of kings were raised in the household, trained in warfare, law, and Christian devotion, preparing for future rule. Noble children, too, were often fostered at court, strengthening bonds between aristocratic families in the dynasty. This practice ensured that loyalty was woven into the very fabric of upbringing, as the next generation of leaders grew up together under the shadow of the king's palace. The rhythms of the court reflected the rhythms of the year. Seasons of campaigning alternated with seasons of feasting and hunting. Festivals of the church marked the calendar, with Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days celebrated with solemn mass and grand banquets. Hunting expeditions offered both leisure and demonstration of martial skill, with kings leading nobles into forests in pursuit of boar and deer. These activities were not only entertainment but displays of strength, reinforcing the connection between kingship, warrior virtue, and the bounty of the land. The court was also a place of intrigue. Nobles competed for influence, whispering counsel into the king's ear, forming factions or plotting against rivals. Queens and their households participated in these struggles, advancing the interests of their children or allies. Bishops sought favour for their churches, while ambassadors from other kingdoms negotiated alliances or marriages. The court was a living arena of politics, where every gesture, every gift, every feast carried meaning. Dagobert then's court at Paris offers the clearest glimpse of this life. Chroniclers describe the splendour of his household, the justice he dispensed, and the generosity he showed to both nobles and the church. His burial at Saint-Denis amid treasures and prayers symbolised the union of dynasty, court, and church. Later, kings would imitate his courtly rituals, but the strength of his reign made them seem natural, binding the image of Merovingian kingship to the grandeur of palace life. To envision the Merovingian royal court, then, is to see more than a residence. It was the beating heart of the dynasty, where kingship was enacted daily, where rituals bound people together, where wealth and power were made visible, and where the sacred and the political intertwined at every turn. Without the court, the Merovingian monarchy would have been little more than a wandering band of warriors. With it, kingship took on the dignity of permanence, radiating authority outward across Francia, in a golden display of ritual and daily life. The Merovingian kings were not only rulers of courts and patrons of churches. At the core of their authority stood their identity as warriors. To be king among the Franks was to be a man who could summon men to arms, who could lead them in battle, and who could reward them with spoils of victory. The long hair that symbolised Merovingian sacred kingship was also the sign of a warrior lineage, a reminder that kingship had been won on the battlefield and was preserved by the sword. The The Frankish peoples who had followed Clovis and his descendants expected their kings to demonstrate valour in war, to protect their subjects from enemies, and to expand the horizons of their power. In the early generations of the dynasty, warfare was constant. Clovis himself had built his kingdom through campaigns against rival Franks, Alemanni, Visigoths, and Burgundians. His victories had not only secured territory, but created the aura of a king chosen by God, his baptism following directly upon the triumph over the Alemanni. Later rulers inherited this expectation. To remain strong, the Merovingian kings had to continue to lead armies, to demonstrate that the dynasty still possessed the vigour that had made it great. A king who failed in war risked losing the loyalty of his warriors and the respect of his subjects. The armies of the Merovingians were not permanent standing forces, but rather levies summoned from the nobility and their dependents. At the king's call, nobles gathered their retainers, forming bands of armed men who came to serve in campaigns. The bonds of loyalty that tied warriors to nobles, and nobles to the king, were sealed through oaths and gifts. In battle, these forces combined into formidable armies, though their composition varied depending on the region and the campaign. Heavy-armed warriors fought with spears, swords, and shields, while lighter-armed men carried axes and bows. Horses were used, though cavalry was not yet the dominant arm it would later become. Armies were mobile, able to cover ground quickly, raiding and striking before melting back into the countryside. The king himself rode at the head of these armies, not as a distant commander, but as a warrior who fought alongside his men. Chronicles speak of kings in battle, their long hair flowing, their presence inspiring courage. The personal valour of the king was essential, for in the chaos of combat it was his example that rallied men and gave meaning to the struggle. A Merovingian king who refused to fight or who displayed cowardice would have undermined the very foundations of his rule. Kingship was inseparable from warrior identity, and even in times of peace the memory of battles fought and victories won sustained the legitimacy of the dynasty. Campaigns were not only about conquest, but also about tribute and plunder. Victorious kings demanded payment from defeated peoples, extracting wealth that enriched the royal treasury and provided rewards for loyal warriors. Gold, silver, livestock, and slaves flowed into Francia as a result of campaigns, their distribution reinforcing the bonds of loyalty. Nobles who received gifts of land or treasure from the king in return for their service became more firmly tied to the dynasty, while common warriors were sustained by the prospect of booty. Warfare was thus not simply destruction, but a mechanism of wealth and social cohesion. The frontiers of Francia offered constant opportunities for war. To the east, the Alemanni, Thuringians, and Bavarians tested Frankish strength. To the north, the Saxons remained a formidable people, their resistance a recurring theme in Frankish campaigns. To the south, the Visigoths, and later the expanding power of Muslim Spain presented challenges. The Merovingians engaged in raids, punitive expeditions, and full-scale wars across these frontiers, each campaign reaffirming the vigour of the dynasty. The annals are filled with accounts of kings marching against rebellious subjects or foreign enemies, demonstrating that the sword was never far from the throne. Among the most famous campaigns were those fought by Dagobert I of Austrasia in the mid-6th century. He extended Frankish influence into Italy, intervening in the wars between the Ostrogoths and the Byzantine Empire. His coins, minted with his own image, reflect the confidence of a king who saw himself as a player on the wider stage of Europe. Later, Dagobert I continued this tradition, asserting Frankish authority over the Saxons and other peoples. His campaigns brought tribute and recognition, making him one of the most powerful rulers of his age. These successes reinforced the image of Merovingian kings as not merely local rulers, but as figures whose power reached across frontiers. The rituals of warfare also shaped Merovingian kingship. Before battle, priests blessed the army, invoking divine protection. Relics of saints were carried into the field, their presence believed to ensure victory. defeat could be interpreted as divine displeasure, while triumph confirmed the king's sacred mandate. The intertwining of war and religion reinforced the perception that kings fought not only for wealth or power, but as instruments of God's will. The memory of Clovis's baptism after victory served as a constant reminder that divine favour was linked to martial success. Warfare also influenced the internal politics of the dynasty. The division of the kingdom among the sons of Clovis created rival courts, each with its own armies. Brothers fought one another as readily as they fought external enemies, their contests decided on the battlefield. Civil wars between Neustria and Austrasia became recurring episodes, with armies clashing and cities besieged. Queens such as Brunhild and Fredegund played decisive roles in these conflicts, directing armies and using warfare as a tool of dynastic survival. The cycle of partition and reunion, so characteristic of Merovingian history, was driven by the logic of warfare as much as by inheritance. The experience of battle shaped Frankish society. Warriors gained honour and status through valour, their reputations carried in stories told at feasts. Nobles who proved themselves in war strengthened their claims to land and privilege. Even the common freeman summoned to serve in the levy found his identity bound to the collective experience of fighting under the king's banner. In this sense, the Merovingian kingdom was not only a political entity but a warrior society, its cohesion maintained through the shared risks and rewards of war. The spoils of war also fed into the cultural display of the dynasty. Weapons, armour and treasures captured in campaigns adorned the royal court, symbolising the strength of the king. Burials from this period reveal swords, shields and helmets, placed alongside the dead, testifying to the centrality of warrior identity. The imagery of kingship, long hair, sword, throne, was inseparable from the reality of constant war. To be a Merovingian king was to embody this warrior ideal, to stand as both ruler and champion. The practice of expansion through warfare did not produce a centralised empire in the Roman sense. The Merovingians ruled a patchwork of regions, each with its own traditions and elites, bound together by the authority of the king and the memory of shared victories. The fragility of this arrangement meant that constant displays of martial strength were necessary. If the king could not protect his people or maintain dominance over rivals, the unity of the realm would fracture. War was thus both the foundation and the burden of kingship, demanding constant vigilance and energy. Dagobert Thasta, remembered as the last great Merovingian ruler, embodied this role with particular effectiveness. His campaigns extended Frankish power, his court displayed the wealth of conquest, and his authority was respected across Europe. Yet even in his reign, the growing power of the mayors of the palace hinted at the future shift. These officials, who commanded armies and managed estates, gradually accumulated the functions of kingship. By the time of his successors, the kings themselves would be less visible on the battlefield, their warrior image fading even as the tradition lingered. Still, the memory of the Merovingian warrior kings endured. Chronicles preserved tales of their victories, their long hair flowing in battle, their swords flashing as they led their men. The cult of saints was intertwined with these memories, casting the kings as chosen by God to defend the faith and their people. Even as the dynasty declined, the image of the warrior king remained central to the idea of Frankish rule, a legacy that the Carolingians would later inherit and transform. To follow the Merovingian kings through their wars is to see how the dynasty built its authority not only in courts and churches but on the battlefield. Armies summoned at the king's command, nobles bound by loyalty and gift, relics carried into war, victories celebrated in feasts, and the spoils of conquest adorning palaces. All these elements sustained the image of kingship. The dynasty rose through the sword, was preserved by the sword, and in many ways was undone by the same cycle of violence that had made it strong. To understand the Merovingians fully, it is not enough to view them only as political rulers, warriors, or patrons of the church. They also carried with them a mystique, a sense of sacred kingship that set them apart from ordinary men. This aura was not just a matter of power or wealth, but of symbolism, ritual, and physical presence. Above all, it was the long hair of the Merovingian monarchs that embodied this sacred identity. Chronicles from their time, as well as the traditions that survived after their fall, consistently described the dynasty as the long-haired kings. This was no trivial fashion choice, but a deeply embedded marker of their role as rulers set apart, touched by divine or even supernatural legitimacy. In the early medieval world, physical attributes often carried symbolic weight. For the Franks and other Germanic peoples, the body of the king was not simply his own, it was the vessel of kingship itself. The hair of the Merovingian monarchs was a sign of their sacral nature, a distinction that separated them from the warriors who served them and the nobles who might rival them in wealth or influence. To cut the hair of a Merovingian king was not a mere insult, it was an act of deposition. Long hair and kingship were bound together, so that the absence of one meant the absence of the other. In the eyes of their subjects, a shorn Merovingian could no longer rule, his sacred status stripped away with the locks of his hair. The origins of this symbolism reached deep into both Frankish custom and broader Indo-European traditions. Long hair had often been associated with vitality, virility, and divine favour. Among the Franks, it seems to have carried a specifically royal meaning, just as priests and monks mark their separation from the world through tonsure, shaving the crown of the head, so kings mark their sacred distinction by the opposite practice, by growing their hair long as a visible sign of their office. It was a living crown, bestowed not by jewels or diadems, but by the natural growth of the body itself, signifying a direct connection between the king and the sacred order of the cosmos. This symbolism appears repeatedly in Merovingian history. When rivals sought to remove a king, they often did so by cutting his hair and sending him into a monastery. Such a fate was not simply exile, but symbolic death. The royal body had been transformed from sacred to ordinary, from king to monk. One famous example is the fate of Childeric III, the last Merovingian ruler, who was deposed by Pepin the Short in 751. His hair was cut, and he was sent to a monastery, his kingship erased. Yet this practice long predated Childeric. Earlier princes who lost in dynastic struggles were shorn and enclosed in monasteries, their long hair replaced with clerical tonsure. For the Franks, this ritual had a power greater than execution, for it neutralized the sacral danger of royal blood while preserving life. The long hair of the Merovingians also carried mythic associations. The semi-legendary Merovech, from whom the dynasty traced its name, was said to have had extraordinary origins, possibly linked to the sea or to a creature beyond human. In such stories, the distinctive appearance of the dynasty was a marker of their difference, a reminder that their authority was not merely inherited, but bound to mysteries beyond ordinary comprehension. The long-haired kings thus embodied a fusion of myth, tradition, and political necessity, their bodies serving as the living symbols of their dynasty's right to rule. Sacred kingship in the Merovingian era was reinforced not only by hair, but by ritual. Kings were consecrated, not yet with the elaborate anointing ceremonies of later medieval monarchs, but with blessings and the presence of bishops at their accession. Their power was linked to sacred sites, such as the shrine of St. Denis, where Dagobert chose his burial place. Their rule was framed by Christian liturgy, their campaigns blessed by relics, their courts suffused with priests and bishops who reminded subjects that the dynasty's power was sanctioned by God. In this way, the sacred aura of the long-haired kings was integrated into the growing Christian order, even as it drew upon older, pre-Christian traditions. The idea of the king's body as sacred also extended into the belief that the dynasty carried a divine mandate through its bloodline. To be born of Merovingian stock was to inherit not just royal privilege, but a mystical connection to authority. Queens who bore children for the dynasty became central figures, their wombs carrying not only heirs but vessels of sacred continuity. Rivalries among brothers or cousins were more than political disputes. They were contests over who embodied the dynasty's sacred inheritance most fully. Even when Merovingian kings descended into weakness, their bloodline was still revered, their long hair still a reminder that they belonged to a different order of being. The symbolic power of long hair also shaped the perception of rebellions and usurpations. When nobles rose against a king, they were not simply challenging political authority. They were challenging a sacred order embodied in the royal body. This made rebellion a dangerous act, fraught with the risk of sacrilege. Conversely, to support a long-haired king was to stand on the side of divine order, to affirm loyalty not only to a man but to a principle. This is why chroniclers so often emphasize the hair of the kings. It was shorthand for legitimacy itself. The rituals surrounding royal death also reflected this sacred conception. Merovingian kings were buried with treasures, relics, and Christian rites, their bodies laid in places of sanctity such as Saint-Denis. Their long hair, often emphasized in accounts, accompanied them to the grave as a mark that even in death they remained kings. The cults of saints intertwined with this royal memory, for the dynasty aligned itself with sacred figures who reinforced its legitimacy. The burial of Dagobert at Saint-Denis is one of the clearest examples, a moment when the sacred king rested beside the patron saint of Francia, embodying the union of dynasty and sanctity. The sacred character of Merovingian kingship did not mean that kings were free from criticism. Chronicles record their sins, their violence, and their excesses, but even when condemned, they were still treated as figures set apart. Their failings were judged not only as personal faults, but as disruptions of the divine order. The punishment of such kings was therefore bound to ritual, hair-cutting, deposition, or confinement in a monastery, all of which carried a sacred logic of purification. Ordinary punishments would not suffice, for the king's body and hair were more than personal, they were dynastic and sacred. This unique conception of kingship helps explain both the endurance and fragility of the Merovingians. Their sacred aura gave them legitimacy even in times of weakness. Nobles and bishops continued to recognize them as the rightful rulers, even when mayors of the palace exercised real power, because the long-haired king was still the symbol of the dynasty. At the same time, the dependence on this symbolism made the dynasty vulnerable. Once hair was cut, once the royal body was neutralized, kingship could pass to another without bloodshed, as happened when the Carolingians replaced the last Merovingians. The sacred aura both protected and constrained the dynasty, making it unique but also fragile in the face of political change. The fascination with the long-haired kings lingered long after the dynasty's fall. Later writers, including Carolingian chroniclers, preserved the memory of Merovingian hair as a mark of archaic sanctity. Even when mocked as idle, roi fainéants, or do-nothing kings, the image of their flowing locks remained part of their mystique. In the medieval imagination, they were remembered as rulers of a different order, closer to myth than to ordinary monarchs. Legends grew around their lineage, sometimes linking them to hidden bloodlines or mysterious powers. The hair that had once marked sacred kingship became the thread of later stories that sought to explain the dynasty's enduring fascination. The aura of the long-haired kings thus captures the essence of Merovingian sacred kingship. Their authority was not only political but embodied, not only enforced by armies but inscribed in their very appearance. To see a Merovingian king was to see legitimacy in the form of hair, flowing as a visible crown, sanctified by tradition and reinforced by ritual. Their monarchy was not just rule by men, but rule by symbols, by the intertwining of body, myth, and divine favour. In this lies their enduring mystery, the reason why the Merovingians stand apart in the history of medieval Europe as figures whose kingship was as much sacred theatre as political power. Among the many dimensions of Merovingian rule, few were as significant for the long arc of European history as their role in the preservation and adaptation of law. The Merovingian dynasty inherited a world in which Roman legal traditions, Germanic customs, and Christian moral teachings overlapped, clashed, and blended. Out of this mixture came the legal codes that would guide Frankish society and influence medieval Europe for centuries to come. At the centre of this development stood the Lex Salica, the Salic law, a code associated with the Salian Franks, which became not only a practical guide to justice, but a symbol of continuity and identity. It was through these laws, as much as through their wars or rituals, that the Merovingians expressed their authority and gave shape to the realm of Francia. The Lex Salica had its origins in the early 6th century, around the time of Clovis and his immediate successors. Written in Latin but infused with Germanic concepts, it was one of the earliest attempts to put into writing the customary laws of a people who had long relied on oral tradition. The act of writing down the law was itself revolutionary. It signalled a desire for permanent stability and recognition that a kingdom of multiple peoples required fixed rules that could be appealed to consistently. In a world where memory and tradition had long sufficed, the written law became an enduring anchor, capable of surviving disputes, deaths, and shifting alliances. The Lex Salica was not a code of abstract principles, but a detailed listing of offences and the compensations attached to them. It was above all a tariff of penalties, assigning monetary value to crimes and wrongs. Theft, assault, murder, insults, all were covered by precise fines, expressed in solidi, the currency of gold. This system reflected the older Germanic practice of Wehrgild, the payment owed for the value of a person harmed or killed. Instead of revenge and endless cycles of blood feud, the law sought to channel disputes into a system of compensation. The Salic law thus represented both continuity with the customs of the Franks and adaptation to the needs of a larger, more complex kingdom. The Merovingian kings played a central role in the preservation and enforcement of this legal tradition. Kings were the ultimate guarantors of justice, and the law was closely linked to their authority. Copies of the Salic law were issued and reissued under different rulers, with modifications and additions reflecting changing times. Later manuscripts even preserved royal prefaces, framing the law as a gift of the king to his people, a mark of his role as protector and judge. The intertwining of king and law meant that justice itself was seen as an extension of royal authority, a visible demonstration that the monarch stood at the centre of order. One of the most striking features of the Lex Salica was its precision. It assigned different fines for the theft of animals, tools, or crops, carefully calibrating the value of each. It specified penalties for insults or injuries, differentiating between a blow that knocked out a tooth, one that broke a limb, or one that merely caused bruising. Even the pulling of a woman's hair was assigned a fine. This detailed approach reflected a society in which honour and property were both vital, and where disputes could easily spiral into violence if not checked by agreed-upon compensations. By laying out a fixed tariff, the law sought to prevent vendettas and maintain peace through predictable remedies. The law also reveals the social structure of Merovingian Francia. Fines varied depending on the status of the victim. To harm a noble carried a higher penalty than to harm a common freeman, while the killing of a slave required compensation to the owner, rather than recognition of the slave's own rights. The hierarchy of society was thus inscribed into the law, with distinctions between nobles, freemen and slaves carefully maintained. Justice under the Salic tradition was not blind in the modern sense. It was calibrated to reinforce the social order, recognising rank and privilege as intrinsic to the value of a person. Women, too, appear in the Salic law, though often in ways that highlight the limitations of their rights. Women could inherit property in certain circumstances, but the famous provision of the law excluded them from inheriting the Salic land, the ancestral estates that were considered the core of family patrimony. This exclusion would later echo through history, invoked in the late Middle Ages to bar women from inheriting the French throne. In its Merovingian context, it reflected the deep association of landholding with male lineage and warrior responsibility. While women were protected from certain forms of harm by specified fines, their legal role remained secondary, tied to their position as daughters, wives, or widows. Justice under the Merovingians was not limited to the written code. The king himself was expected to preside over courts, hearing cases and rendering judgments. This image of the king as judge was central to his identity, as important as his role as warrior. Chronicles describe kings sitting in public, listening to disputes, and pronouncing decisions. These acts were often ceremonial, reinforcing the visibility of royal justice. To bring a case before the king was to acknowledge his supremacy, and to receive judgment from him was to accept the binding authority of his rule. Local courts also played a crucial role in administering justice. Nobles, bishops, and royal officials presided over gatherings where disputes were heard, oaths sworn, and fines assigned. The presence of witnesses was essential, for much of the law depended on sworn testimony. The ordeal, whether by combat, hot iron, or water, remained a method of proof, reflecting the belief that divine judgment would reveal the truth where human certainty failed. These procedures combined Roman legal forms, Germanic custom, and Christian ritual into a system that was at once practical and symbolic. The Lex Salica was not the only law code of the Merovingian realm. Other peoples under Frankish rule, such as the Ripuarian Franks, Burgundians and Alemanni, had their own codes, also written down in the 6th and 7th centuries. The coexistence of multiple laws within the same kingdom reflects the principle of personal law, whereby individuals were judged according to the laws of their own people rather than a single universal code. This system, though complex, allowed the Merovingians to govern a diverse realm while respecting local traditions. The Salic law stood out, however, as the code most closely tied to royal identity, a symbol of the dynasty itself. The intertwining of law and religion deepened as the church's influence grew. Bishops participated in courts, monasteries became centres of literacy that preserved legal texts, and Christian morality increasingly shaped the content of justice. Crimes against the church, such as theft from a holy place or assault on a cleric, carried special penalties. The sanctuary of churches provided protection for fugitives, intertwining legal practice with sacred space. In this way, the Merovingian legal tradition was not static but evolving, adapting to the needs of a Christian kingdom. The endurance of the Salic tradition testifies to its power. Even after the fall of the Merovingians, the Salic law remained a living document, copied, amended, and invoked by later rulers. Under the Carolingians, it continued to serve as a foundation of legal practice, its fines and tariffs still shaping justice. In the late Middle Ages, its provision excluding women from inheritance would resurface in dramatic fashion, used to justify the succession of French kings and to exclude rival claims. What began as a code of compensation among early Franks thus became a cornerstone of royal ideology centuries later. The Merovingians, by preserving and shaping this legal tradition, ensured that their legacy extended far beyond their dynasty. While their military victories faded, while their palaces crumbled, the Salic law remained, copied in manuscripts, interpreted by jurists, and invoked by kings. In the fragile and violent world of the early Middle Ages, this code offered a measure of stability, a reminder that even in a realm of shifting power, law endured as the foundation of order. It was in this intertwining of law, justice, and kingship that the Merovingians inscribed themselves into the deeper structures of European history. The history of the Merovingian dynasty is often told through the deeds of its kings, its battles, and its laws, yet woven beneath these public displays of power was another layer of influence, one that moved through households, alliances, and bloodlines. Queens and noble women were central to the making and sustaining of Merovingian authority, even though their power rarely appeared in the blunt form of battlefield command or legislative decree. Their realm was subtler, expressed in the bearing of heirs, the negotiation of marriages, the management of wealth, and the use of personal networks that extended across Francia. To understand the dynasty fully, one must step into this hidden world, where women acted as mediators, patrons, and at times as rulers in their own right. Queenship in the Merovingian age was never a passive role. A queen was not simply the wife of a king, but a figure whose very presence symbolised legitimacy. Through her, dynasties joined. Through her womb, heirs were produced. Through her household, the machinery of the court was maintained. The marriage of a king to a queen was almost always political, designed to secure alliances or bind noble families to the throne. Queens came from powerful backgrounds, sometimes from rival tribes or foreign courts, sometimes from noble Frankish families whose support was essential. Their arrival at court brought with it a network of kinship ties, retainers, and obligations that extended the king's reach. One of the most powerful examples is Clotilde, the Burgundian princess who became the wife of Clovis. Her marriage bound the Franks to the Burgundians, and her influence was decisive in Clovis's conversion to Christianity, a turning point not only for the dynasty, but for the history of Europe. Chroniclers emphasise her role as a pious queen who urged her husband to accept baptism, framing her as the model of Christian queenship. Yet Clotilde was also active in the brutal politics of succession, struggling to preserve the rights of her sons after Clovis's death, embroiled in conflicts that pitted her against other branches of the dynasty. Her story illustrates how queens move between sacred ideals and hard realities, embodying both Christian virtue and ruthless ambition. Later queens carried this dual role even further. Brunhild, a Visigothic princess, became one of the most remarkable figures of the Merovingian age. Married to King Dagobert I of Austrasia, she quickly rose from foreign bride to powerful political player. After her husband's assassination, she acted as regent for her son, then for her grandsons, ruling Austrasia for decades. She engaged in building projects, founded monasteries, and reformed administration, but she also waged relentless struggles against her rivals. Her feud with Fredegund, the Queen of Neustria, became legendary, a decades-long conflict marked by intrigue, assassination, and open war. Brunhild's career demonstrates how queens could seize power directly, using both their dynastic position and their personal networks to act as rulers in their own right. Fredegund, her great rival, offers the mirror image of this story. Originally a servant in the royal household, she rose to become the wife of King Chilperic I, and then the dominant force in Neustria. Cunning, ruthless, and resourceful, Fredegund controlled her husband's court, eliminated rivals, and fought bitterly to secure the throne for her son Clothar II. Her reputation in the chronicles is one of violence and intrigue, filled with tales of poisonings and assassinations. Yet behind the moralising tones of the chronicles lies the reality that she was extraordinarily effective. She preserved her son's inheritance against formidable opposition, ensuring the continuation of her line. In her, we see how even women of humble origins could, through intelligence and ambition, rise to command the destiny of kingdoms. The struggles of Brunhild and Fredegund are often presented as exceptional, but in truth, they reveal the structural opportunities available to queens in the Merovingian system. Because kings died young, often in battle or by assassination, widows frequently served as regents for underage heirs. This placed them at the centre of government, commanding armies through generals, issuing decrees through councils, and negotiating with bishops and nobles. Their authority was not unlimited, but it was real, and it could endure for years. The fragility of Merovingian succession, with kingdoms divided among sons and constantly reunited, gave women opportunities to wield influence during moments of uncertainty. Beyond the dramatic careers of Brunhild and Fredegund, the daily role of queens in court life was also crucial. A queen presided over her own household, which mirrored the structure of the king's but focused on attendants, artisans, and clerics who served her directly. Through this household, she dispensed patronage, rewarded loyalty, and cultivated alliances. Queens often acted as intercessors, petitioned by subjects to plead their cases before the king. This role reinforced their image as merciful figures, balancing the stern justice of the king with compassion. It also gave them practical influence, as those who sought favours understood the value of winning a queen's ear. Noblewomen, too, held significant roles in Merovingian society. While they did not carry the visible aura of queenship, they controlled vast estates, managed wealth, and directed households that were themselves centres of power. A noblewoman who inherited land or who brought it as dowry into marriage exercised authority over dependents, tenants, and slaves. She oversaw production, resolved disputes, and ensured the prosperity of her domains. When husbands were absent on campaign or at court, wives effectively governed estates, making decisions that sustained the economic backbone of the kingdom. Some noblewomen, like Radegund, left an indelible mark on Merovingian culture. A Thuringian princess forced into marriage with King Clovis I, she eventually abandoned court life to found a monastery at Poitiers. There she became a revered abbess, known for her piety and charity, and was later canonized as a saint. Her career illustrates another path of female influence, one that moved from the secular to the sacred. By embracing religious life, Radegund carved out a new sphere of authority, commanding respect that outlasted her dynasty and shaped the spiritual landscape of Gaul. The relationship between queens and the church was especially significant. Many queens acted as patrons of monasteries, endowing them with land, commissioning churches, and promoting saints' cults. These acts served both pious and political purposes. By aligning themselves with the church, queens strengthened their legitimacy, secured prayers for their families, and built networks of loyalty among clerics. The church, in turn, celebrated these queens as models of virtue, even when their political careers were marked by violence. The dual image of the queen as both pious mother and formidable ruler captures the complex interplay between gender, power, and sanctity in the Merovingian world. Marriage alliances orchestrated by noblewomen also shaped the political landscape. Daughters of noble families were married into rival dynasties, cementing alliances or healing feuds. These unions were not only political contracts, but also carriers of cultural exchange, bringing foreign customs, languages, and traditions into the Frankish court. Queens like Brunhild, who came from Spain, brought with them not only dowries but also retinues of advisors, scribes, and clerics, adding to the cosmopolitan character of the Merovingian world. Through marriage, women were not merely passive tokens, but active agents, their presence reshaping the networks of power. Even in their absence from chronicles, the influence of noblewomen can be traced in charters, donations, and archaeological remains. Their names appear as donors to churches, their jewellery and household goods buried in graves reveal wealth and taste, and their patronage shaped the cultural life of Francia. Though male chroniclers often minimise their agency, the evidence shows that women were central to the functioning of society. They managed resources, negotiated alliances, and transmitted dynastic legitimacy. Without them, the Merovingian realm could not have endured. The hidden world of queens and noblewomen thus adds a dimension of depth to Merovingian history. They were the mediators between households and kingdoms, the guardians of heirs, the patrons of the church, and, at times, the rulers who wielded power more decisively than kings themselves. Their influence was not always visible in chronicles written by men who focused on battles and laws, but it was there in the continuity of dynasties, the prosperity of estates, and the survival of the kingdom through crises. In their hands, the threads of Merovingian power were woven and preserved, ensuring that the dynasty remained not just a sequence of kings, but a living network of families, alliances, and sacred bonds. As the Merovingian dynasty aged, the outward image of sacred kingship persisted, but beneath the surface the balance of power was beginning to shift. The long-haired monarchs still sat on their thrones, their lineage still invoked the sacred legitimacy of their ancestors, and their presence still carried symbolic weight. Yet increasingly, it was not the king but his household officials who directed the affairs of the realm. Chief among these were the mayors of the palace, officials who began as stewards of royal households but who, over time, became the true governors of the kingdom. Their rise tells the story of how the Merovingian monarchy, once so vigorous under Clovis and Dagobert, gradually gave way to a new structure of power, paving the way for the Carolingian dynasty. In the earliest years of Merovingian rule, the mayor domus was essentially the head of the royal household. The palace was not just the king's residence, but the centre of administration, where food was gathered, treasures stored, documents written, and orders issued. To manage this complex operation, the king relied on trusted officials, and among them the mayor of the palace stood foremost. At first his responsibilities were domestic, ensuring that the household ran smoothly, that revenues were collected, and that dependents were organised. Yet because the palace was the nexus of royal power, this office quickly grew in significance. Whoever controlled the household controlled access to the king, and whoever controlled access to the king influenced decisions. As the Merovingian kingdom expanded, the need for administrative coordination grew as well. The Frankish realm was not a centralised state in the Roman sense, but a collection of regions, each with its own traditions, nobles and bishops. The king needed agents who could keep the machinery of governance moving, who could ensure the collection of tribute, the management of royal estates, and the distribution of justice. The mayors of the palace filled this need, extending their reach from the household into the broader administration of the realm. By the 7th century, they were already among the most powerful figures in the kingdom, often drawn from the leading noble families whose wealth and networks gave them authority of their own. The decline of Merovingian vigour made this shift more pronounced. After the reign of Dagobert I, the kings who followed often lacked the energy or will to govern directly. They were remembered by later chroniclers as rois fainéants, do-nothing kings, figures who embodied the sacred aura of kingship but delegated real decision-making to others. While this label exaggerates their passivity, it reflects a real dynamic. Kings increasingly became symbols, while officials carried out the functions of rule. The mayors of the palace were ideally positioned to fill this vacuum, wielding power in the king's name while steadily building their own authority. The political fragmentation of the Merovingian realm also accelerated the rise of the mayors. The division of Francia into Neustria, Austrasia and Burgundy created multiple courts, each with its own household and its own mayor of the palace. These mayors became not just administrators, but regional leaders, tied to the great noble families of their territories. They commanded armies, negotiated with bishops, and collected revenues, sometimes acting independently of the king. In times of crisis, it was often the mayor rather than the monarch who provided leadership. The office, once subordinate, had become essential to the functioning of the realm. Some mayors emerged as towering figures in their own right. In Austrasia, the family of the Pippinids rose to prominence, beginning with Arnulf of Metz and Pippin of Landen. Their descendants would dominate the office for generations, combining it with vast land holdings and deep ties to the church. By the late 7th century, figures like Pippin of Herstal wielded power that rivaled and eventually overshadowed that of the kings they served. In Neustria, rival families contested the office, leading to wars and shifting alliances. The struggle between Neustria and Austrasia in this period was as much a contest between noble houses and their mayors as between royal dynasties. The authority of the mayors was reinforced by their control over military forces. Kings were still expected to lead armies, but as their presence on campaign became less frequent, the mayors increasingly took command. They summoned the levies, distributed booty, and directed campaigns. Victories won under their leadership enhanced their prestige, while defeats diminished the king's already weakened image. In the eyes of warriors and nobles, the mayor of the palace could seem more like the true leader than the long-haired monarch whose sacred presence no longer translated into battlefield vigour. The church, too, played a role in elevating the mayors, as bishops and abbots sought patrons for their monasteries and protection for their lands. they often turned to the powerful noble families behind the mayors. These alliances reinforced the secular authority of the office with sacred endorsement. The Pippinids in particular cultivated ties with the church, donating lands, founding monasteries, and aligning themselves with reforming bishops. In return, the church offered legitimacy and support, seeing in these families a source of stability that the weakening kings could no longer guarantee. The rituals of kingship persisted, but they grew increasingly hollow. The coronation of a long-haired king still drew upon sacred symbolism. His hair still marked him as a descendant of Merovech, and his presence was still invoked in laws and charters. But often the charters were issued at the direction of the mayor. The armies fought under his command, and the revenues flowed through his administration. Kings became figureheads, indispensable for the symbolic continuity of the dynasty, but dispensable in the daily mechanics of governance. This dual structure of power, sacred monarch and practical mayor, defined the later Merovingian age. The careers of individual mayors illustrate this process vividly. Pippin of Herstal, who served as mayor of Austrasia, defeated his Neustrian rivals at the Battle of Tertry in 687, establishing his supremacy over the entire Frankish realm. Though the Merovingian king still reigned, it was Pippin who ruled. His victory marked the moment when the office of mayor became the true centre of power in Francia. From that point forward, his descendants, the Carolingians, would dominate, until finally one of them, Pippin the Short, dispensed with the fiction altogether and took the crown. Yet the rise of the mayors was not simply the story of one family or one office. It was the result of structural changes in Frankish society. The growing power of nobles, the increasing importance of landholdings, the dependence of kings on aristocratic support, and the intertwining of secular and sacred authority all combined to weaken the personal monarchy of the Merovingians. The mayors of the palace were the natural beneficiaries of this process, their office perfectly situated at the intersection of household, court, and kingdom. The transformation did not happen overnight. For decades, kings and mayors coexisted in a delicate balance. The sacred aura of the king was still needed, his long hair still invoked, his signature still affixed to documents. But increasingly, the mayors spoke with their own voice, commanded their own armies, and made their own policies. The fiction of royal supremacy masked the reality of aristocratic dominance. By the early 8th century, the Merovingian monarchy had become a shell, while the real power of the Frankish kingdom lay in the hands of the mayors of the palace and the noble families behind them. This shift marked a profound change in the nature of kingship itself. Where once the king had been both warrior and judge, both sacred figure and active ruler, now he was primarily sacred symbol, while governance passed to men whose legitimacy derived not from hair or bloodline, but from practical authority, military success, and aristocratic support. The rise of the mayors thus represents the transition from one form of kingship to another, from the sacral monarchy of the Merovingians to the administrative and military monarchy of the Carolingians. The mayors of the palace were the bridge between these two worlds. They preserved the continuity of governance while the old dynasty declined, and in doing so they prepared the way for the next. Their rise is a reminder that dynasties are not immortal, that sacred symbols can persist even as practical power shifts, and that the structures of administration can outlast the men who once embodied them. In their ascent we see the beginning of the end for the Merovingians and the first stirrings of a new dynasty that would reshape Europe. The Merovingian world was not a unified kingdom in the modern sense, but a collection of territories, each with its own traditions, aristocracies, and ambitions. Among these, two stood out as the most powerful and enduring, Austrasia and Neustria. From the 6th century onward, the relationship between these regions defined much of Frankish politics, and their rivalry often flared into open war. It was a struggle of geography, culture, and competing noble families fought under the names of kings, but increasingly shaped by the ambitions of their mayors and the networks of aristocrats who stood behind them. To understand the decline of the Merovingians, it is essential to grasp the centrality of this Austrasian-Neustrian contest, for in its battles and compromises the balance of power within Francia was decided. Austrasia, the eastern Frankish kingdom, had its centre in the valleys of the Rhine and Moselle. Its heartland stretched into what is now eastern France, western Germany, and parts of Belgium and Luxembourg. This was the frontier zone of the old Roman world, a land of fortified towns, deep forests, and aristocratic estates that reached back into Roman senatorial traditions. The bishops of cities like Metz, Reims, and Cologne wielded great authority, and noble families built immense power through landholding and military service. Austrasia's outlook was often toward the east, toward the Germanic tribes across the Rhine, whose incorporation into the Frankish sphere was a constant project. Its identity was tied to expansion and consolidation along the frontier, giving it a reputation for martial vigour and aristocratic pride. Neustria, by contrast, was the western kingdom, centred in the fertile lands of northern Gaul, stretching from the Seine to the Loire. Its roots were deeper in the Roman past, with Paris, Soissons, and Rouen among its key cities. Neustria was wealthier in agricultural terms, closer to the old Roman heartlands, and often seen as the more cultured of the two realms. Its aristocracy was tied to the great Gallo-Roman families who had adapted to Frankish rule, blending Roman traditions with Germanic kingship. Neustria looked west and south, toward Brittany and Aquitaine, toward ties with the Church of Rome, and toward the legacy of Roman civilization. If Austrasia embodied the frontier spirit, Neustria embodied the settled wealth of the old empire. The division between Austrasia and Neustria was not absolute. Both were parts of the Frankish realm, ruled at different times by the same king or by brothers who inherited the divided territories of their father, yet the tension between them was constant, fueled by aristocratic rivalries, competing traditions and the ambitions of their rulers. When unity was strong, as under Clovis or Dagobert, the division could be managed, but when kings died young, when heirs were numerous, or when noble families pursued their own dominance, the tension erupted into war. One of the earliest and most dramatic expressions of this rivalry came in the wars between Queen Brunhild of Austrasia and Queen Fredegund of Neustria. Their feud, spanning decades in the late 6th century, was not only personal but territorial. Brunhild sought to preserve Austrasian independence and strength, while Fredegund fought to secure Neustrian supremacy for her son. The wars between them devastated the Frankish kingdoms, with assassinations, betrayals, and pitched battles marking the era. The rivalry of the queens became the rivalry of their realms, embedding the pattern of conflict into the political fabric of Francia. The division was reinforced by the structure of succession. The Merovingians practiced partible inheritance, dividing the kingdom among sons rather than concentrating it in a single heir. As a result, Austrasia and Neustria often fell to different branches of the dynasty, each jealously guarding its autonomy. Attempts to reunite the kingdoms through war or marriage were frequent, but unity rarely lasted beyond a generation. The cycle of division and reunion became a hallmark of Merovingian politics, with Austrasia and Neustria as the central poles around which the process revolved. By the 7th century, the rivalry had deepened into a struggle between aristocratic factions. In Austrasia, noble families such as the Pippinids built networks of power that made them dominant within the court. In Neustria, rival houses sought to control access to the king and to monopolise offices. The mayors of the palace became the champions of these factions, transforming the rivalry into one of regional identity as well as noble competition. The wars of this period, fought under the names of young kings, were in reality contests between these noble houses for control of the Frankish realm. One of the most significant flashpoints was the Battle of Tertry in 687, when Pippin of Herstal, mayor of Austrasia, defeated the Neustrian forces under King Theuderic III and his mayor Berchar. The victory established Austrasian supremacy and marked the ascendancy of the Pippinid family, soon to become the Carolingians. Though the Merovingian king continued to reign, it was Pippin who ruled, and from this point on the Neustrian aristocracy was forced into submission. Tertiary was not merely a battle between armies, but the culmination of decades of rivalry, a turning point that reshaped the balance of power within Francia. Yet the rivalry did not disappear with Austrasia's victory. Neustrian identity remained strong, and nobles continued to resist Austrasian dominance. The two regions retained distinct traditions and loyalties, and kings who attempted to rule both often faced challenges in balancing them. Even under the Carolingians, the memory of this division persisted, shaping political culture for generations. The rivalry had become embedded in the very fabric of Frankish society, a reminder that Francia was not a single, homogeneous realm, but a patchwork of identities and powers. Civil wars between Austrasia and Neustria were devastating not only politically but socially. Armies marched across the countryside, devastating crops and villages, while nobles shifted loyalties in pursuit of advantage. The church often tried to mediate, calling for peace and unity, but bishops themselves were often aligned with regional interests, tied to aristocratic families whose fortunes rose and fell with the conflict. For ordinary people, the wars meant disruption of daily life, increased taxation, and the constant threat of violence. Yet for the aristocracy, these wars were opportunities, moments when fortunes could be made, lands seized, and rival families humbled. The rivalry also shaped the identity of the Merovingian monarchy itself. Kings were often forced to act as arbiters between Austrasia and Neustria, balancing appointments, marriages, and policies to maintain equilibrium. When they failed, war followed. The inability of the dynasty to resolve this structural division was one of the key reasons for its decline. The Merovingians could preserve sacred kingship, but they could not prevent the centrifugal forces of their own inheritance practices and aristocratic rivalries from pulling the realm apart. The rise of the mayors of the palace was, in part, the solution to this problem, strong men who could enforce unity where kings could not. In the long run, the Austrasia-Neustria rivalry contributed directly to the transition from Merovingian to Carolingian rule. The Pippinids built their power in Austrasia precisely because of this dynamic, using their military victories against Neustria to establish themselves as the indispensable rulers of the realm. Neustrian nobles, weakened by defeat, were forced to accept the leadership of the Austrasian mayors, even as they continued to maintain their own traditions. The rivalry that had once divided the kingdom thus laid the groundwork for its reunification under a new dynasty, one that would claim to transcend the divisions that had plagued the Merovingians. The story of Austrasia and Neustria is therefore not just one of civil war but of transformation. It reveals how geography, culture, and aristocratic ambition combine to shape the destiny of a dynasty. It shows how the structures of partible inheritance, sacred kingship, and aristocratic power interacted, producing a cycle of division and conflict that could not be broken from within, and it explains why, by the end of the 7th century, the long-haired kings remained in name, but the real future of Francia lay with the men who had mastered these rivalries and turned them to their advantage. The decline of the Merovingian dynasty did not come as a sudden collapse, but as a slow fading, a long twilight in which the sacred image of kingship endured while its substance withered away. The kings of this later period were still anointed, still wore their hair long as the sign of their lineage, still presided over ceremonies, and still issued charters bearing their names. Yet beneath this outward continuity, the machinery of government had passed into the control of others. Nobles, bishops, and most of all the mayors of the palace now dictated the policies of the realm. The kings remained, but they were shadows of their predecessors, invoked for legitimacy but powerless in practice. This transformation was remembered vividly by later chroniclers, who coined the phrase rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings. While the term exaggerates their passivity, it reflects the perception that these rulers no longer directed the fate of their kingdom. From the mid-7th century onward, the Merovingian monarchs became increasingly dependent on their mayors, men like Pippin of Herstal and later Charles Martel, whose military and political leadership overshadowed the throne. The kings continued to appear in rituals, but they no longer shaped events. They were, in essence, puppets maintained for their sacred value. The causes of this decline lay deep in the structures of Merovingian rule. The practice of partible inheritance divided the kingdom repeatedly, weakening central authority and forcing kings to rely on powerful nobles to govern distant regions. The aristocracy, enriched by land and fortified by kinship networks, grew ever more independent. The Church, once a pillar of royal power, increasingly allied itself with local magnates who endowed monasteries and protected bishops. In this shifting balance, the king's personal authority diminished. Where Clovis and Dagobert had commanded armies and dictated laws, their successors found themselves hemmed in by aristocrats who demanded influence, and by officials who executed policies in their name but not at their command. The image of the king, however, remained potent. Sacred kingship could not simply be abolished. The long hair of the Merovingian monarch was still seen as a mark of divine election, a visible link to the mythic ancestor Merovech. The anointing of kings with holy oil, the processions, the enthronements, all carried a weight of tradition that no noble family could ignore. To dispense with the king entirely would have been to risk undermining the very fabric of legitimacy on which all authority depended. Thus the shadow kings remained, maintained as figureheads even as their mayors ruled in their stead. Their lives reflected this ambiguous role. Later descriptions portray them as living in relative obscurity, confined to palaces in remote towns, brought out for ceremonial occasions, and then returned to quiet seclusion. They issued charters when required, affixed their seals to documents prepared by others, and lent their presence to assemblies convened by mayors or bishops. In some accounts, they are shown riding in simple carts rather than on horseback, a striking image of their diminished status. Whether this detail is literal or symbolic, it captures the perception of kingship reduced to ritual without substance. The careers of individual shadow kings illustrate this pattern. Dagobert III, ruling in the later 7th century, reigned in name over both Neustria and Austrasia, but relied entirely on his mayors to enforce authority. His successors, such as Clovis III and Dagobert III, were young, weak, or politically isolated, unable to resist the dominance of their officials. By the time of Chilperic II and Theodoric IV in the early 8th century, the monarchy had been reduced to a hereditary symbol, perpetuated only because no one yet dared to remove it. It was under these kings that Pippin of Herstal and later Charles Martel exercised real control, commanding armies, negotiating with the church, and distributing lands. The chroniclers of the Carolingian age, eager to justify the deposition of the Merovingians, painted these shadow kings in the bleakest colours, emphasising their impotence and irrelevance. Yet it would be a mistake to see them as wholly without significance. Their presence was still necessary, for the aura of kingship could not yet be transferred to another family without risk. The shadow kings embodied continuity, a reminder that Francia was still united under the sacred bloodline of Clovis, even if practical rule belonged to others. Their very weakness became their utility, for as passive figures they could be manipulated to authorise the actions of stronger men. The rituals of kingship continued, but increasingly they were hollow performances. The king's hair was still carefully preserved, his coronation still conducted with solemnity, his charters still framed in traditional formulas. Yet those who witnessed these ceremonies knew that the real decisions were being made elsewhere. It was a theatre of legitimacy, designed to reassure subjects that order persisted even as the substance of power shifted. In this sense, the Shadow Kings played an essential role, sustaining the illusion of continuity while the foundations of the dynasty crumbled. The contrast between image and reality was most visible in the realm of warfare. In earlier generations, Merovingian kings had personally led armies, their presence on the battlefield a sign of legitimacy and courage. By the 7th century, this role had passed almost entirely to the mayors of the palace. Figures like Pippin of Herstal and Charles Martel became the true war leaders of the Franks, celebrated for their victories against rivals and foreign enemies. The kings remained in their palaces while their mayors secured the borders, defeated invaders, and redistributed conquered lands. Military prestige, once the heart of kingship, now belonged to others. Economically, too, the kings became dependent on their officials. The revenues of royal estates, once the foundation of Merovingian wealth, were increasingly diverted into the hands of nobles and monasteries. Grants of land, often made to secure loyalty or to reward the church, eroded the king's direct resources. By the 8th century, the royal fisc had shrunk dramatically, leaving the kings unable to fund armies or patronage networks of their own. The mayors, by contrast, controlled vast estates and used them to reward followers, reinforcing their dominance. The kings, reduced to ceremonial roles, no longer had the means to assert independence. The imagery of decline reached its climax in the deposition of Childeric III in 751. Brought to the throne only as a last representative of the bloodline, Childeric ruled entirely under the shadow of Pippin the Short, who as mayor commanded all real power. When the time came, the fiction could no longer be sustained. With the blessing of the papacy, Pippin deposed Childeric, cut his sacred hair, and confined him to a monastery. The act was not merely political, but symbolic. To cut the king's hair was to strip him of his sacral identity, to render him a man like any other. With that gesture, the Merovingian line ended, and the Carolingians assumed the throne. Yet even in their decline, the Shadow Kings held meaning. Their reigns remind us that power is not always exercised openly, that symbols can endure even when substance is gone, and that legitimacy can outlast authority. The Merovingians in their twilight reveal the complexity of early medieval politics, where ritual, tradition, and sacred aura could preserve a dynasty long after its strength had ebbed. They also highlight the necessity of symbols in human societies, for even those who wielded real power needed the presence of a king to cloak their rule in legitimacy. The Shadow Kings, reduced to puppets, nonetheless bridged the gap between two eras. They allowed the Frankish kingdom to maintain a facade of continuity, while aristocratic power and ecclesiastical support shifted toward the Carolingians. Their quiet presence in palaces and processions gave cover for transformation, enabling a dynasty to die not with sudden collapse but with gradual fading. In that twilight, the structures of the new monarchy took shape, preparing for the moment when the fiction could be dispensed with and a new dynasty crowned. The decline of Merovingian power in the realm of politics did not erase the dynasty's influence in culture, ritual, and material life. If anything, it is in the remains of their art, their gold work, and their burial traditions that the Merovingians speak most vividly to later generations. Long after their kings had become shadows, their craftsmanship continued to shine from the graves of nobles, their rituals echoed in the Christianization of funerary practice, and their artistic language revealed a society where Roman traditions blended with Germanic motifs to create something distinct. To follow the Merovingians through their art and burials is to glimpse their world not as chroniclers described it, but as they themselves envisioned it, in the objects they crafted, the symbols they carried, and the ways they honoured their dead. The Merovingians inherited a rich cultural landscape. On one side lay the lingering traditions of Rome, with its monumental architecture, mosaic art, and Christian iconography. On the other lay the Germanic heritage of the Franks, expressed in ornamental metalwork, weaponry, and symbolic patterns rooted in tribal identity. The dynasty's genius was not in choosing one over the other, but in fusing them into a hybrid language that spoke to both past and future. In this synthesis, we find ornate brooches decorated with cloisonné garnets, coins bearing royal names and Christian crosses, and burial sites where Roman ritual merged with new Frankish expressions of identity. Goldwork stands at the centre of this legacy. Frankish craftsmen became renowned for their ability to work precious metals into dazzling forms, combining technical skill with symbolic meaning. The use of cloisonnés, in which thin strips of gold formed cells filled with garnet or glass, created objects that glittered with light, evoking both wealth and sacred aura. Brooches, belt buckles, and sword hilts adorned with such decoration were not mere ornaments but markers of status and identity. To wear them was to declare one's place in society, one's connection to the royal court, and one's participation in the sacred order of the kingdom. These objects often accompanied their owners into the grave. Merovingian burials reveal a society deeply invested in material display, where the dead were equipped with weapons, jewellery, and household items for the journey beyond. Noble men were buried with swords, spears, and shields, symbols of their role as warriors and protectors. Women were interred with brooches, necklaces, and beads, markers of their household status and kinship ties. Children, too, received objects that declared their family's rank. These graves were not private acts but public declarations, visible to communities and remembered by generations. They were stages upon which the social order was reaffirmed, even in death. The royal burials of the Merovingians stand out in particular. In the Basilica of Saint-Denis near Paris, later the resting place of French kings, Merovingian rulers were interred with splendour. Their tombs, though often disturbed or repurposed in later centuries, originally testified to the union of sacred kingship and Christian ritual. Clovis himself was buried in Paris beside Queen Clotilde, his tomb a symbol of the dynasty's fusion of Frankish kingship with Roman Christianity. Dagobert the Sunster, remembered as the last strong king of the dynasty, was laid to rest at Saint-Denis, his burial linking the monarchy directly with the cult of Saint Denis, patron of Paris. These burials tied the dynasty's legitimacy not only to blood and tradition, but to the sacred geography of the Christian Church. Christianity profoundly reshaped Merovingian burial rites. In earlier generations, the Franks had practiced cremation, or inhumation with pagan rituals, but as Christianity spread, burial in consecrated ground became the norm. Churches and monasteries became centres of commemoration, with elites seeking to be buried close to saints' relics, believing that proximity to the holy would aid their souls in the afterlife. The rise of the cult of saints in Merovingian Gaul transformed burial from a family-centred ritual into a community act tied to the Christian cosmos. To rest near a saint's shrine was to share in divine intercession, a privilege sought by kings and commoners alike. Yet the old traditions did not vanish entirely. Even as Christian prayers replaced pagan rites, the grave goods of the Merovingian elite retained symbolic resonance. Weapons and jewellery were placed alongside the dead well into the 7th century, blending older Germanic customs with new Christian beliefs. The meaning of these objects may have shifted, from provisions for the journey beyond to symbols of earthly rank, but their presence shows how cultural layers intermingled. The Merovingians did not abandon their heritage, they reinterpreted it in light of their new faith. Coins offer another window into this legacy. Minted in gold and silver, Merovingian coins bore the names of kings, but also the marks of local moneyers, reflecting a decentralised yet vibrant economy. Crosses and Christian symbols adorn their surfaces, signalling the dynasty's alignment with the church. Yet the style of the coins, often crude by Roman standards, expressed a new aesthetic, one rooted in simplicity and symbolic clarity rather than naturalism. These coins circulated widely, binding together the diverse regions of the kingdom and spreading the image of royal authority, however diminished in practice. Merovingian art also found expression in stone carving, manuscript illumination, and ecclesiastical ornament. The churches founded by kings and queens were adorned with sculpture and liturgical vessels, blending Roman models with Frankish motifs. The influence of Mediterranean art travelled north through trade and pilgrimage, bringing new styles to Gaul. At the same time, local craftsmen developed distinct traditions, visible in interlacing patterns, stylized animals, and abstract designs that would later flourish in Carolingian and even Romanesque art. In this way, the Merovingians acted as a bridge, transmitting classical forms into medieval Europe while creating new ones of their own. Burial landscapes further illuminate their legacy. Cemeteries from the Merovingian era often display rows of graves aligned with care, suggesting both communal order and Christian symbolism. Archaeological excavations have revealed hundreds of such cemeteries, filled with grave goods that tell the story of daily life, social rank, and evolving belief. In some sites, richly adorned burials stand beside simpler ones, reflecting the hierarchy of society. In others, children's graves are marked with care, showing the value placed on lineage and memory. These cemeteries were not hidden places, but visible markers of community identity, located near settlements and churches to link the living and the dead. The role of women in these burial rites is especially striking. The grave goods of Merovingian women often include elaborate jewellery, weaving tools and household items, reflecting their central role in family and economy. Queens and noblewomen were buried with splendour, their adornments testifying to both wealth and authority. Radegund, though later venerated as a saint, left behind a legacy that blended royal status with spiritual power, her burial and cult embodying the intertwining of dynastic and religious identity. Through their graves, women asserted their place in the memory of the dynasty, ensuring that their roles were not forgotten. The persistence of Merovingian artistic traditions into the Carolingian age further underscores their legacy. The cloisonné techniques, the stylized motifs, and the fusion of Roman and Germanic forms influenced the art of the next dynasty, providing the foundation for the cultural revival of the 8th and 9th centuries. Even as the Merovingians faded from political prominence, their aesthetic vision endured, shaping the material culture of medieval Europe. To walk through a Merovingian cemetery, or to hold a piece of their jewellery, is to enter their world more directly than through any chronicle. These objects and burials speak of values that transcended politics, honour, lineage, faith, and memory. They reveal a society where kingship was sacred, where wealth was displayed as a language of power, and where the dead were honoured with both old and new symbols. They show how the dynasty conceived of itself, how it wished to be remembered, and how it forged a cultural identity that would endure long after its political eclipse. The Merovingian legacy in art, gold, and burial rites is thus not an afterthought, but a central part of their story. It reveals how a dynasty expressed itself in material form, how it blended traditions to create a distinct cultural language, and how it left behind a heritage that could be rediscovered in graves and treasures centuries later. In their objects and their burials, the Merovingians spoke across time, ensuring that even as their political line ended, their presence would never wholly vanish from the history of Europe. By the middle of the 8th century, the Merovingian dynasty existed largely as a symbol, a shell of kingship maintained for the sake of continuity, while the true reins of power lay in the hands of the mayors of the palace. For decades, men like Pippin of Herstal and Charles Martel had commanded armies, distributed lands and negotiated with the church, while the kings remained in their palaces, issuing charters prepared by others, their long hair the only reminder of their sacral role. The fiction of Merovingian rule still mattered, for sacred kingship could not be discarded lightly, but by the reign of Childeric III it had become increasingly untenable. The dynasty lingered in ritual and memory, yet the age of the Shadow Kings was drawing to its inevitable end. Childeric III's reign began in 743, but he was not chosen for his strength of character or his ability to govern. Instead, he was brought out of obscurity and placed on the throne by Carloman and Pippin the Short, the sons of Charles Martel. The Frankish kingdom had endured years of instability after the death of Theuderic IV in 737, when no new king was crowned for 6 years. During this interregnum, Charles Martel ruled as mayor without even the pretence of a monarch, a bold step that demonstrated just how far the Merovingians had declined. Yet after Charles's death, his sons restored the crown, not because they needed a king to rule, but because they needed one to legitimise their own actions. Childeric was chosen as a convenient figurehead, a man whose lineage could cloak the authority of the Carolingians in sacred continuity. Little is known of Childeric as a person. The sources describe him as a passive figure, confined largely to ceremonial functions, issuing documents dictated by Pippin and Carloman, and lending his royal presence to assemblies where real decisions were made by others. Later chroniclers, writing under Carolingian influence, emphasised his impotence, portraying him as the quintessential shadow king, brought out for display and then hidden away again. Whether he possessed any ambition or vision of his own is impossible to know, but the machinery of power left him no room to act. He was a monarch in name only, his sacred hair the last vestige of Merovingian authority. The decline of the dynasty was not simply the result of weak kings, it reflected the structural realities of 8th century Francia. The royal fisc, the land and revenue once controlled by the monarchy, had been eroded by centuries of donations to the church and grants to nobles. Without resources, the king could no longer maintain independent armies or patronage networks. By contrast, the Carolingians had amassed vast estates, allowing them to reward followers and fund campaigns. Military leadership, once central to kingship, now belonged to the mayors, who led armies against rivals and external threats. The victories of Charles Martel, particularly against the Muslim incursions into Gaul, gave him prestige that no Merovingian could match. The very functions of kingship had migrated into Carolingian hands. The church played a decisive role in the transition. For generations, the Merovingians had been closely tied to Christian legitimacy, their baptisms and burials marking them as sacred rulers. But by the 8th century, the alliance between throne and altar was shifting. Charles Martel had already cultivated close ties with the papacy and with reforming bishops, granting lands and protecting monasteries in exchange for support. Pippin the Short deepened this relationship, recognising that the church could provide the spiritual endorsement needed to transform his de facto power into de jure kingship. The papacy, facing threats from the Lombards in Italy and lacking strong protection from Byzantium, looked northward to the Franks for aid. The alliance of interests was clear. The Pope needed a powerful protector, and Pippin needed sacred legitimacy to replace the fading Merovingians. The process unfolded carefully, for the deposition of a dynasty was no small matter. Around 751, Pippin sent envoys to Pope Zachary, posing a question that was as much political as theological. Should the title of king belong to the man who wielded power, or to the man who held it in name only? The Pope's reply, recorded in later sources, was unambiguous. It was better, he said, that the man who exercised real authority should also bear the royal title. With this sanction, Pippin moved to end the fiction. Childeric III was deposed, his long hair cut in a ceremony that symbolised the loss of sacral kingship, and he was confined to a monastery. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was not merely a humiliation, but a ritual act of stripping away the divine mandate that had defined the dynasty for centuries. Without his hair, Childeric was no longer a king, but an ordinary monk, removed from the cycle of inheritance and political life. With that act, the Merovingian line was extinguished, its sacred symbolism transferred to new hands. In his place, Pippin the Short was anointed king of the Franks, the first Carolingian to hold the crown. The ceremony, performed by bishops and infused with biblical symbolism, marked a profound shift in the nature of kingship. Where the Merovingians had claimed legitimacy through bloodline and sacred tradition, the Carolingians grounded theirs in the sanction of the church. Pippin's anointing invoked the Old Testament model of kings chosen by divine will through the hands of priests, linking his rule to biblical precedent and papal authority. The awe of sacred kingship did not disappear. It was redefined. The fall of Childeric III and the rise of the Carolingians thus represented both continuity and change. Continuity, because the fiction of sacral monarchy persisted, now with a new dynasty. Change, because the basis of legitimacy shifted decisively from inherited bloodline to ecclesiastical anointing. The Merovingians had once ruled as the long-haired kings whose lineage alone sufficed. The Carolingians would rule as the anointed kings whose authority was consecrated by the Church. This transformation marked the beginning of a new era, in which the alliance of throne and altar would shape the destiny of Europe for centuries. Yet the memory of the Merovingians lingered. Chroniclers remembered them as both great founders and powerless shadows, as the dynasty of Clovis who united the Franks, and of Childeric III who ended in obscurity. Their graves, their treasures, and their legends continue to speak of a time when kingship was still bound to myth and symbol. The Carolingians, for all their vigour, inherited not only the throne but the legacy of the dynasty they displaced, a legacy that would echo in medieval imagination long after the last Merovingian hair had been cut. The deposition of Childeric III was not the erasure of a dynasty, but the transformation of kingship itself. In that moment, Francia turned a page, moving from the twilight of one order into the dawn of another. The Merovingians faded into shadow, but through them the Carolingians inherited the sacred mantle of rule, ensuring that kingship in Europe would continue, reshaped but unbroken, into the centuries that followed. The fall of Childeric III did not bring an end to the Merovingians in the minds of those who followed. If anything, their absence from the throne gave them new life in memory and imagination. Dynasties that rule with power leave a mark in records, laws, and battles, but dynasties that fade into twilight become fertile ground for legend. The Merovingians, remembered both as founders and as shadows, came to occupy a liminal place in European memory, where history and myth blended freely. In chronicles, hagiographies, and folklore, they were depicted as sacred rulers, cursed figures, or hidden heirs. Their very obscurity invited speculation, and their aura of ancient kingship became a canvas upon which later generations painted meanings of their own. Medieval chroniclers shaped this legacy in different ways. Writers working under Carolingian influence often emphasized the weakness of the later Merovingians, portraying them as indolent, powerless, and unworthy of the rule. The phrase roi fainéants, do-nothing kings, crystallized this image. By casting their predecessors as shadows, the Carolingians justified their own ascent, presenting themselves as the restorers of vigour and order. Yet even within these critical accounts, there was an undercurrent of awe. The Merovingians were remembered as the first Christian kings of the Franks, the dynasty that had brought Clovis to baptism and bound the kingdom to the church. To dismiss them entirely would have been impossible. Legends soon filled the spaces where history fell silent. The origins of the dynasty, linked to Merovech and the mysterious sea beast said to have fathered him, acquired new resonance in medieval imagination. This tale of supernatural conception, strange as it appeared, was repeated and elaborated, giving the Merovingians an aura of otherworldly ancestry. It suggested that their bloodline was touched by forces beyond the ordinary, a motif that resonated in an age when genealogy and sanctity often intertwined. Whether taken literally or metaphorically, the story marked the dynasty as unique, a family set apart by fate itself. The sanctity of certain Merovingian figures further fed their legendary status. Queens like Radegund, who abandoned court life to found monasteries and was later venerated as a saint, embodied a spiritual dimension to the dynasty's legacy. Their stories preserved the memory of Merovingian authority in a religious key, linking the family to the sacred landscape of saints and miracles. Radegund's cult, celebrated in Poitiers, carried the dynasty's name into the devotional life of communities long after its political fall. Other figures, like Queen Bathilde, were also sanctified, remembered for piety and charity. Through them, the dynasty's memory became inseparable from the world of Christian holiness. At the same time, darker legends emerged. Some accounts portrayed the later Merovingians as cursed, their decline seen as the result of moral decay or divine judgment. The image of kings confined to palaces riding in carts rather than leading armies, lent itself to tales of humiliation and downfall. These stories resonated with the medieval fascination for the rise and fall of rulers, where dynasties embodied moral lessons about the transience of earthly power. To speak of the Merovingians was to recall both glory and decline, both sacred beginnings and ignoble ends. The burial places of the dynasty also became focal points of memory. The Basilica of Saint-Denis, where Merovingian and Carolingian kings alike were buried, served as a site of continuity, where the memory of earlier rulers was honoured in ritual and liturgy. Pilgrims and chroniclers alike were reminded of the Merovingians as they visited the tombs of Dagobert or Clovis, their presence a silent testament to the dynasty's enduring role in shaping the kingdom. Even when their names faded from political documents, their resting places kept them alive in sacred geography. As the Middle Ages advanced, the Merovingians were increasingly drawn into broader currents of legend. In some traditions they were linked to tales of hidden heirs, surviving bloodlines, or secret claims to the throne. The notion that the dynasty had not truly ended but continued in obscurity offered fertile ground for speculation. Medieval imagination often embraced the idea of rulers returning from exile, of kings who slept in secret awaiting their return. The Merovingians, with their mysterious fall and their aura of sacred ancestry, were natural candidates for such myths. Later writers wove the dynasty into the tapestry of European legend. In certain traditions, the Merovingians were said to be connected to esoteric knowledge or hidden treasures. Their association with sacred kingship and their supposed descent from a sea being gave them a mystical quality that made them attractive to storytellers searching for origins that reached beyond the ordinary. Though much of this was speculation and invention, it testified to the enduring fascination the dynasty inspired. The Carolingians themselves helped shape this memory, both by contrast and by inheritance. By portraying the Merovingians as weak, they highlighted their own vigour, yet by adopting Merovingian symbols and claiming continuity with Clovis's baptism, they also absorbed parts of the legacy they displaced. Charlemagne, the greatest of the Carolingians, could not present himself without reference to the Christian kingship first established by the Merovingians. Thus, even in displacement, the dynasty's memory was woven into the identity of its successors. The medieval imagination often blurred the boundaries between dynasties, saints, and myths. The Merovingians, existing in that blurred space, became both history and legend, both real rulers and symbolic figures. Their memory was not fixed but adapted to the needs of each generation, to justify Carolingian power, to inspire devotion through saintly queens, to caution against decline, or to fuel speculation about hidden bloodlines. In this malleability lay their enduring power. As centuries passed, their name never entirely vanished. Chroniclers of the High Middle Ages still recalled Clovis's baptism, Dagobert's wealth, and the shadow kings of the dynasty's decline. Monasteries preserved hagiographies of Merovingian queens, while archaeologists of later ages would uncover their treasures, giving tangible form to their remembered splendour. Legends of sea-born ancestry and mystical descent survived in whispers, long after the dynasty's last real king had been shorn of his hair. The Merovingians thus lived on in memory, myth, and medieval legend not as mere relics of a forgotten past, but as a dynasty transformed in imagination. Their story was reshaped by chroniclers, sanctified by saints, darkened by tales of decline, and enlivened by rumours of hidden heirs. In this way, they achieved a kind of immortality. Their presence felt not only in the history they made, but in the stories told about them. The Merovingian Dynasty, which had begun in the age of collapsing Roman power and tribal migrations, ended on the throne with the cutting of Childeric III's long hair in the mid-8th century. But though their political authority was extinguished, the idea of the Merovingians refused to vanish. A dynasty remembered as both sacred kings and shadow rulers could not remain buried in chronicles alone. Instead, their legacy spilled across centuries, transforming into something larger than history. They became not only figures of the early medieval past, but symbols of eternal bloodlines, carriers of myths that reached into the modern imagination. It began with the simple persistence of memory. Chroniclers never forgot Clovis's baptism or the dynasty's role in binding the Franks to Christianity. Monks preserved the stories of queens like Radegund and Batilde, whose sanctity kept the Merovingian name alive in the devotional life of later generations. The tombs at Saint-Denis and Paris whispered of their presence, even as new dynasties filled the same sacred ground. Each memory kept them from fading, and each memory created opportunities for transformation. The dynasty, though gone in body, survived in aura. By the high Middle Ages, the Merovingians were already slipping into the fabric of legend. The tale of Merovech's birth from the union of his mother and a mysterious sea creature resurfaced, now interpreted not merely as a pagan curiosity, but as a sign of otherworldly ancestry. In a culture fascinated by bloodlines, where saints were believed to transmit holiness through relics and kingship itself was seen as divine, such myths gave the Merovingians a special mystique. Their descent was not entirely of this world, and that idea proved powerful enough to endure long after their lands had been claimed by others. The notion of a hidden bloodline emerged in whispers, fueled by the mysterious decline of the dynasty and the abrupt transfer of the throne to the Carolingians. Could it be, some wondered, that heirs of the Merovingians survived in secrecy? Medieval Europe was filled with tales of sleeping kings and returning rulers, of dynasties extinguished in appearance but living on in obscurity. The Merovingians fit easily into this archetype. Their image as kings, stripped of power yet still bound by sacred lineage, made them natural candidates for legends of survival. A lost branch, a hidden heir, a secret continuity. All of these became part of the lore that surrounded their name. In later centuries, these whispers intersected with broader myths of sacred kingship and hidden treasures. The Crusades, the rise of knightly orders, and the fascination with holy relics created fertile ground for connecting the Merovingians to stories of the Grail, of ancient wisdom, and of guardianship over mysteries. The idea that their bloodline carried unique significance blended with legends of saints and knights, producing a genealogy that stretched beyond history into myth. The dynasty became not just rulers of the past, but supposed custodians of esoteric truths. The modern era revived these themes with new intensity. In the 19th century, when Romanticism turned its gaze toward medieval origins, the Merovingians reappeared in literature and speculation. French historians rediscovered their graves, their artifacts, and their cultural contributions, reminding the world that the dynasty had once ruled at the very foundations of France. At the same time, esoteric thinkers and fringe writers seized upon their myths, weaving them into theories of hidden bloodlines and lost heirs. The story of a dynasty born of the sea and sanctified by Christian baptism became a canvas for imagining connections that stretched far beyond the limits of history. Perhaps the most famous of these modern reinterpretations was the notion that the Merovingians had preserved a secret bloodline, one that survived their political fall and carried forward into later centuries, even into modern Europe. Writers claimed connections to the Priory of Sion, to the Knights Templar, and to guardians of the Holy Grail. Some even suggested that the dynasty's bloodline carried a direct link to Christ himself, merging medieval legend with biblical imagination. Though historians dismiss such claims as fabrications or misinterpretations, they demonstrate how powerfully the Merovingian aura continued to resonate. The dynasty became less a fact of history and more a symbol of eternal kingship, a reminder of the allure of sacred ancestry. The fascination endured in popular culture. Novels, films, and speculative histories have repeatedly invoked the Merovingians as the lost bloodline, the dynasty that supposedly carried mysteries hidden from the world. Their name, once associated with brooches, burial rites, and shadow kings, now appears in modern thrillers and conspiracies. From esoteric societies to best-selling books, the idea of the Merovingians has been stretched and reshaped to fit the human hunger for hidden truths. They have become, in effect, a dynasty of legend as much as one of history. But beneath these layers of speculation, the real legacy remains. The Merovingians were the first Christian kings of the Franks, the rulers who bridged Rome and medieval Europe, the dynasty that left its mark in law, in art, and in sacred geography. Their bloodline may have been cut from the throne, but their influence flowed into the Carolingians, and through them into the very fabric of Europe. Their memory and myth does not erase their achievements in history, but rather extends them, giving the dynasty a life beyond its chronological limits. The eternal bloodline, then, is less about hidden heirs than about the persistence of memory. Dynasties that fade from politics often endure most strongly in imagination, and the Merovingians are a prime example. Their sacred aura, their myths of origin, their role in shaping early medieval kingship, all of these ensured that they would never truly vanish. Whether remembered as saints, as shadows, or as secret heirs, they became part of Europe's collective memory, living on in ways no sword or crown could extinguish. Even today, when archaeology uncovers their graves and scholars debate their history, the Merovingians remain as much a matter of fascination as of fact. Their brooches glint in museum cases, their names echo in medieval chronicles, and their myths circulate in modern imagination. The dynasty that once ruled Francia has become timeless, its story stretching from the collapse of Rome to the realms of modern mystery. The kings are long gone, but the idea of their eternal bloodline endures, not in hidden heirs, but in the fascination they continue to inspire. And so the story of the Merovingians fades into silence, not in the manner of a tale that is finished, but like the echo of a voice that still carries across the centuries. They began in legend with the Sea King Merovech, rose to power with Clovis, baptized their realm into Christianity, and for 200 years shaped the destiny of a people who would become the heart of medieval Europe. Their kings were warriors, patrons of the church, and symbols of sacred rule. Their queens became saints and power brokers, their treasures shone in graves, and their laws bound together a world that was still finding its order after the fall of Rome. They vanished from the throne when Childric's hair was shorn, yet they lived on in memory, in the stories of saints, in the glitter of gold pulled from their tombs, and in the endless legends that made their names synonymous with mystery. To some they became shadows, to others saints, and to others still the keepers of a bloodline that stretched into realms of myth. And while dynasties rose and fell after them, the aura of the Merovingians never disappeared entirely, woven into the foundations of France, into the imagination of medieval Europe, and even into the speculations of the modern age. It is in that quiet endurance that their legacy lies, not in crowns or battles alone, but in the way their name still stirs curiosity more than 1,000 years later. As you drift now, think of how history and legend intertwine, how memory keeps what power cannot, and how the Merovingians, once the long-haired kings of the Franks, continue to walk between the lines of fact and story, alive in the imagination of all who remember them.